She had built her entire life on the belief that broken things should be thrown away, and then a child handed her a piece of shattered glass like it was a gift. Eleanor Voss had a reputation that made gallery owners sweat through their linen shirts. She had ended careers with a single paragraph. She had reduced a celebrated sculptor to tears at a Manhattan cocktail party and called it Tuesday. She was 32 years old. She had never once been wrong about art, and she had been punishing herself for 5 years for the one moment she had been catastrophically wrong about everything else. Now she was on a train to Savannah, Georgia, with a mandate to dismantle a gallery show, a carry-on bag containing 6 identical black blazers, and a grief she had folded so many times it had become structural, like the bones inside a wall you only discover when the whole thing comes down. This is a story about what happens when a woman who has made herself into a weapon meets a man who has made himself into a shelter. It is about the art we make from our wreckage. It is about the terrifying, luminous courage of choosing to be loved again. Stay until the end. Tell me in the comments what city you are watching from tonight. And if this story finds you at the exact moment you needed it, you already know what to do. The train slid out of Penn Station at 7:14 in the morning, and Eleanor Voss did not look up from her laptop once. This was not unusual. Eleanor had ridden trains, planes, hired cars, and the occasional ferry across the Venice Lagoon without once registering the landscape outside the window. The world in her considered opinion was adequately represented in the work people made of it. Paintings, sculptures, installations, the occasional ambitious ceramic series, the raw, unedited version. The one full of bad lighting and emotional incontinence and SUVs held little interest for her. She had her coffee black in a paper cup that was already leaving a ring on her laptop sleeve. She had her notes on the Hargrove Gallery show. She had her schedule blocked in 15-minute increments, a document she had once described to her assistant Min as the architecture of a life that functions. Min had said quietly, "Right," and gone back to his desk. The assignment was straightforward. The Hargrove Gallery in Savannah had been generating a specific kind of buzz, the kind that Eleanor distrusted most, the buzz of money pretending to be taste. A curated show of contemporary works by artists whose primary qualification appeared to be that they were expensive. The gallery owner, a woman named Constance Hargrove, had made her fortune in coastal real estate before pivoting to what Eleanor privately called decorative validation, the practice of purchasing prestige through association with art, rather than any genuine understanding of it. Constance had been trying to get Eleanor's attention for 3 years. Eleanor had finally decided to give it to her. The piece would be thorough. It would be precise. It would air-condition whatever room it was read in. Eleanor pulled up the artist bios and began annotating. She was 32 years old, and she was very, very good at this, and there were days when the goodness of it was the only thing that felt real. Outside the window, the American South was beginning to unfurl itself slow and green and dense with heat, but Eleanor did not see it. She was reading about a ceramic artist from Portland whose primary conceptual framework appeared to be the interior dialogue of emptiness, a phrase that made Eleanor's left eye twitch. She typed 3 words in her notes. Emptiness requires substance. Then she deleted them and typed derivative. Move on. The train pulled into Savannah at 2 in the afternoon. She stepped onto the platform and the heat hit her like a wall, warm, humid, impossibly fragrant, carrying with it the smell of something floral she could not immediately name. She stood for a moment with her carry-on beside her, and despite herself, despite all the careful architecture of her schedule, she breathed in once. Deeply. The smell was wisteria. She did not know how she knew this. It wasn't a smell from her current life, which was constructed primarily of espresso printer ink and the particular metallic chill of air-conditioned museum spaces. It was a smell from somewhere older, a memory with no picture attached to it, just a sense of warmth in a garden and something she had been before she became what she was now. She exhaled and picked up her bag. The car took her to the hotel, which was appropriately minimal, a converted 19th century building, pale plaster walls, wrought iron balconies, a lobby that smelled of eucalyptus and old wood. Eleanor approved of it. She unpacked her 6 blazers, arranged her toiletries in order of size, and opened her laptop on the desk by the window. Outside, 2 women were laughing on the sidewalk, below their laughter rising up to her like something being released from a net. She watched them for exactly 3 seconds, and then looked back at her screen. She was in Savannah for 30 days. She had 47 items on her agenda. She told herself this was plenty. It was on the morning of her second day in the city that she first saw the studio. She was walking because Min had added morning walk 20 minutes non-negotiable to her itinerary after her last cardiologist appointment had included the word stress delivered in a tone of some concern. She did not particularly want to walk, but Min had also said in a voice that contained a rare and delicate firmness, "Eleanor, please." So she was walking, her coffee in hand, her eyes on the middle distance, her thoughts already at the gallery. The street she turned down was not on any tourist map. It was the kind of street that Savannah kept tucked between its famous photogenic squares, slightly peeling, slightly overgrown, the Spanish moss hanging so low from the live oaks that it brushed her shoulder as she passed. There were a few converted storefronts. A plant nursery that appeared to be run by a man asleep in a lawn chair, a laundromat with a handwritten sign reading, "Change machine working today only." And there was the studio. She almost missed it. The sign was small and hand-lettered. The paint faded to a color that suggested it had once been blue, August, and CO. Illustrations. The door was propped open with a concrete garden gnome that had been painted over so many times it had lost all facial definition and now wore an expression of abstract serenity. Through the doorway she could hear music, something old and jazzy, and the smell of paint thinner and linseed oil, and something else, something sweeter underneath like crayons, the specific waxy smell of childhood. Eleanor stopped walking. She was not entirely sure why. She stood on the sidewalk with her coffee and looked through the open door into the studio beyond. She could see from her angle a long wooden workbench covered in controlled chaos. Stacks of paper jars of brushes, arranged with a care that contrasted sharply with everything else, half-finished drawings of animals doing things animals did not ordinarily do. A rabbit in a raincoat. A bear with a cello. At the far end of the bench, a man was leaning over a drawing with his back to the door, his shoulders moving with the concentrated quiet of a person who had been alone for long enough that they no longer performed their focus for anyone. And beside him on a stool that had been modified with a cushioned footrest sat a child. The child was perhaps 8 years old, with dark hair that had not been recently combed, wearing a t-shirt with what appeared to be a faded dinosaur on it. He was not drawing. He was arranging a series of smooth stones in a careful line along the edge of the bench, picking each one up with precise deliberateness, placing it, then adjusting it a fraction of a centimeter to the left. His lips were moving. He was counting something, or perhaps he was recounting it, returning always to a beginning. The man said without turning around, "2 more, bud, and then we flip them." The boy did not answer. He picked up the next stone. Eleanor realized she had been standing on the sidewalk for what was by any reasonable social metric too long. She turned and walked back the way she had come. She finished her coffee. She did not think about the studio again, she told herself, for the remainder of the day. She thought about it approximately 9 times. Arthur Navarre had been awake since 5:15 that morning, which was when Leo woke up. Leo always woke at 5:15. This had been true for 3 years as reliably as sunrise, and Arthur had long since stopped fighting it. He got up. When Leo got up, the coffee began the morning sequence that they had arrived at through 4 years of trial and error, of meltdowns and adjustments, of reading and rereading every piece of literature he could find, and then ultimately throwing most of it out in favor of watching his son and listening to what Leo himself was telling him in the particular and precise language of a child who expressed very little in words and everything in behavior. Eggs first. Always eggs. Scrambled, not runny, served in the blue bowl, not the green one. Leo had never explained why, and Arthur had never asked, because asking why was not the relevant question. The relevant question was always, what does he need right now, and can I give it to him? Usually Arthur could give it to him. Sometimes the morning went sideways before he'd had his first cup of coffee, and on those mornings he would stand in his kitchen at 5:27 in the morning and breathe through his nose and remind himself of the particular quality of Leo's laugh, which was rare and therefore precious, a sudden burst of unguarded delight that came without warning and ended just as quickly like a door briefly opened onto a very bright room. He thought about that laugh a lot. Today is Wednesday. Leo said, sitting at the kitchen table with his eggs in his blue bowl and his eyes fixed on a middle point slightly above the table's surface. This was not a question. Leo reported the day of the week every morning as a form of anchoring. Arthur had started doing it too, had started saying it back to him as a kind of call and response. Wednesday, Arthur confirmed. Eggs, then. We go to the studio. Miss Patricia at 3. Leo said nothing. He ate his eggs in the specific order he always ate them, working from the edge of the bowl toward the center. Arthur drank his coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the wisteria growing along the back fence, which was extravagant this year, hanging in thick purple clusters that caught the morning light and smelled like something from a more generous world. He had moved to Savannah 3 years ago after the divorce. This was the kind of statement that sounded simple and contained multitudes the way geological descriptions of fault lines sounded simple. He had moved because his sister Diane lived here and because he had needed someone nearby who already loved Leo, someone who would not have to be educated in loving him. He had moved because his ex-wife Claire was not a bad person. She was not. He had said this to himself many times in the slow dark of many nights, and arrived always at the same conclusion. She was not a bad person, but the life they had needed to build for Leo was not a life she had known how to build, and at some point the love between them had become something she was maintaining out of obligation rather than choice, and Arthur had loved her enough to release her from that. He had moved to Savannah with an 8-year-old car, 23 boxes a child, and a contract to illustrate a children's book series that paid him enough with extreme discipline to keep the lights on, and the refrigerator stocked, and Ms. Patricia, who was Leo's occupational therapist, and also Arthur sometimes thought a saint compensated for her Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. He had built something here. It was not large. It was not the life he had imagined at 25, which had involved a bigger apartment and probably a dog, and a sense of forward motion that felt less like waiting. But it was theirs, his and Leo's, and it was warm, and there were the eggs in the blue bowl, and the stones on the bench, and the laugh that came through the door like light, and Arthur most mornings was grateful. On this particular Wednesday he was also slightly dread-filled because of a voicemail from his agent. His agent's name was Petra Cassidy, and she called in the way a person knocks on a door before entering a room they already own. Arthur, good news, I think. The Hargrove show opening is Saturday, and I got you on the list. You need to be there. You know Marcus Chen is going to be there, and Marcus has been asking about you if we can get a conversation going about a possible picture book collab. This could be Arthur. This could be significant. Wear something that isn't covered in paint. Call me back. Arthur had not called her back. He knew he needed to. He knew Marcus Chen's name, knew the kind of weight it carried in the illustration world, knew that Petra was not wrong about the significance. He also knew that the Hargrove show was exactly the kind of event that Leo could not survive under normal circumstances, which were circumstances that included a babysitter, a clear plan, a debrief beforehand, and a decompression routine after. Normal circumstances, by definition, required advance notice and the willingness of other humans to show up as promised, which in Arthur's experience was something people promised with great sincerity and delivered with middling reliability. He called Petra back at noon. Leo's sitter canceled, he said when she picked up. I can't go. There was a pause. Petra's pauses were not silences, they were held arguments. Arthur, she said finally, you have an 8-year-old, not a ball and chain. Bring him. Petra, it's a gallery opening. The noise, the lights, the crowd. You said he's been doing better. Better is relative. Marcus Chen is going to be there. Arthur looked at Leo, who was at his end of the workbench arranging his stones with the focused calm of a monk arranging prayer beads. The afternoon light was coming through the skylight in the particular way it came through on clear Savannah afternoons, golden and dense and full of floating dust motes. Leo had noticed the dust motes. He was watching them with his peripheral vision the way he watched things he didn't want to look at directly, as if looking too hard might make them disappear. I'll think about it, Arthur said. Think faster, Petra said and hung up. He looked at the dust motes. He looked at his son. He thought about the electricity bill. Leo, he said, how do you feel about wearing your good sneakers Saturday? Leo did not look up from his stones. The white ones or the gray ones? The gray ones. A pause. The gray ones are acceptable. Arthur exhaled. Okay, he said. Okay, we'll go. What Arthur did not know, could not have known, was that 48 hours later he would be kneeling on a gallery floor with his son in his arms, and a woman in an expensive ruined blazer would be tapping a rhythm on the floorboards beside them, and his life would rearrange itself around that moment as definitively and permanently as a bone setting in a new position after a break. He pulled a fresh piece of paper from the stack and picked up his pencil. At the top he sketched lightly the outline of a bear with a cello. He gave the bear an expression of concentration and tenderness, the expression of a creature doing the thing it was made for, the thing that was hard and necessary and sustaining all at once. He looked at it for a moment. He decided the bear needed a small audience, one rabbit in the foreground sitting very still. Sometimes he thought the act of listening is its own kind of art. He began to draw the rabbit. The wisteria smell was everywhere in Savannah, Eleanor discovered. It came in through the cracked window of the car she hired on Thursday morning to take her to a pre-show walkthrough at the Hargrove Gallery. It drifted up from the squares with their enormous oaks and their hanging curtains of moss. It was in the air of the boutique she walked through briefly, looking for nothing in particular, buying nothing, leaving after 4 minutes with the peculiar restlessness that had been her constant companion for 5 years. The inability to remain anywhere without agenda, without forward motion, without the sense that stopping was a form of sinking. The gallery was on the south end of the historic district in a converted warehouse that Constance Hargrove had spent a significant amount of money making look like it had not been converted. The bones were right wide plank floors, industrial ceiling beams, the kind of proportions that let large works breathe. The bones Eleanor thought walking through the space with a gallery assistant trailing at a respectful distance were the best thing about it. The work was another matter. She moved through the room, slowly making notes. A painter from Charleston, whose large format oils were technically accomplished and emotionally evacuated beautiful surfaces with nothing happening beneath them like expensive wallpaper. A photographer whose series of double exposures layered cityscapes over bodies of water in a way that had been fresh approximately a decade ago. A sculptor from Miami, whose resin pieces were undeniably striking and unmistakably derivative echoes of artists Eleanor could name, without checking her phone, the influence worn so plainly it constituted less an homage than an admission. And then the centerpiece. It was a glass sculpture by an artist named Vance Whitmore, a towering, elaborate construction of blown and fused glass that rose nearly 8 feet from a plinth in the center of the main gallery space. The piece was by any objective measurement impressive. The technical achievement was genuine. The glass caught the gallery's track lighting and fractured it into prismatic spills across the pale walls, and Eleanor stood before it for a long moment. Her head slightly tilted and felt the particular cold clarity of a judgment forming. It was spectacular, and it was about nothing. It was 8 feet of formal expertise in the service of 0 ideas. It was the most expensive, beautiful, empty thing she had seen in years, and in Eleanor's professional experience that was a category crowded with competitors. She wrote in her notebook, Whitmore centerpiece, consummate craftsmanship, catastrophic vacancy, 0 interior life, like looking into a mirror designed by someone who has never seen a face. She underlined the last sentence. The gallery assistant, a young man with the cautious energy of someone who had been warned about her, said from a safe distance, Mr. Whitmore's work has been described as exploring the relationship between transparency and depth. Eleanor looked at him. Has it? She said. He made a small sound that was not quite a word. Make a note, Eleanor said, that the lighting in the northeast corner is too warm. It's flattening the Carrasco piece. The Carrasco, incidentally, is the only work in this room worth looking at, which I suspect is not information your employer wants. She walked back through the main gallery toward the entrance, past the Whitmore sculpture, past the windows, past the smell of fresh white paint, and something floral underneath the wisteria again coming in from a gap somewhere. She stopped at the door. She turned around and looked at the sculpture one more time. It was beautiful. She was not wrong about that. The light through it was genuinely extraordinary, the way the prismatic refractions moved slowly across the walls as the ambient light shifted as if the piece were breathing. It was still about nothing. She turned back to the door and pushed it open and stepped into the warm Savannah afternoon, and the wisteria smell wrapped around her like a hand briefly laid on a shoulder. And she stood on the sidewalk for a moment without walking, without pulling out her phone, without doing anything at all, because there was something in the smell that undid a small specific part of her, and she could not immediately locate the mechanism, and that was intolerable. She walked back to the hotel with her hands in her blazer pockets and her jaw tight, and the smell following her the whole way, light and purple and relentlessly, thoughtlessly kind. In the studio 3 streets north, Arthur Navarre was giving Leo his evening bath, which required the water to be a specific temperature, the shampoo to be the unscented kind, and a running narration of what was happening and what would happen next. "Shampoo now, then rinse, then we're done. Then we read the Dragon Book," Arthur said, holding the small plastic cup above Leo's head, and Leo sat very still with his eyes squeezed shut and his hands flat on his knees, braced for the water. "Then the Dragon Book," Leo repeated. "Then the Dragon Book," Arthur confirmed. He poured the water and watched his son screw his face against the sensation and then relax incrementally as the warmth continued and the sequence proceeded as promised, as always, as known. He thought about the Hargrove opening 2 days away. He thought about his good shirt, which needed ironing. He thought about Leo's gray sneakers, and about Marcus Chen, and about the electricity bill, and about Petra's voice on the phone saying, "Think faster." He thought briefly, and without any context for why, about the dust motes in the afternoon light, and the way Leo had watched them without looking at them directly, seeing them most truly by not looking straight at them. The way some things could only be seen from the corner of your eye. "Done," he said. "Rinse is done. Dragon Book time." Leo stood up from the bath and held out his arms for the towel without being asked, because the sequence was known, and in the known sequence there was safety, and in safety there was the small, extraordinary, ordinary life that Arthur had built around his son, like cupped hands around a flame. He wrapped the towel around Leo's shoulders, and Leo did not pull away, which he sometimes did when the texture was wrong, or the pressure was wrong, or the day had been too much. Tonight, he didn't. He stood in the steam of the bathroom and let himself be toweled off, and Arthur felt the familiar compressed fullness in his chest that he had no adequate word for, that feeling that was love and grief and gratitude tangled so completely together that separating them would have required undoing the whole of it. He didn't want to undo it. He would rather feel all of it messy and complete than feel any of it clean. "Dragon Book," Leo said. "Dragon Book." Arthur agreed. They went to read the Dragon Book. 2 blocks away and several social strata removed, in a hotel room that smelled of eucalyptus and carefully maintained distance. Eleanor Voss sat at her desk with her laptop open and her notes arrayed beside her, and typed the same opening sentence of her review 4 times before deleting it 4 times. Outside, the Savannah night was doing what southern nights do in the late spring, settling into warmth and insect sound and the occasional distant call of something she could not identify, a bird or something else. A sound that suggested the deep nocturnal life of a place that had been here long before anyone built a gallery in it, and would be here long after all the glass sculptures had been reduced to sand. The wisteria smell had followed her to her room. She had closed the window, and it was still here, faint and persistent, like a question she hadn't agreed to answer. She stared at the blank line on her screen. She typed, "The Hargrove Gallery's spring exhibition is a study in the economics of cultural aspiration." She read it back. She left it. It was accurate. It was correct. It was exactly what she intended to say, and it was in the way that all true things stated without warmth are insufficient. She closed the laptop and sat in the room that she had made deliberately impersonal. Her 6 blazers arrayed behind the closet's louvered doors. Her toiletries in their ordered row. Her schedule open on her phone like a map of a country she had made entirely of obligation, and she did not think about anything that she could not immediately write down. This was not nothing. This was in fact everything. This was the whole architecture of it. The days built from precision, the feelings managed through the application of language, the movement forward sustained by never stopping long enough to register what was behind her. She had been very good at this for 5 years. She was at this precise moment still good at it. Outside, the wisteria turned over in the warm, dark air, indifferent to whether she smelled it or not, patient in the way that living things are patient-rooted, and returning present in every season whether or not anyone thought to look. She did not look. She opened her laptop again and continued writing her review, and the words came out of her precisely and correctly sharp as cut glass. And she did not once feel the faint, invisible tremor that had begun in the center of her chest, the first time the smell had reached her on the platform, standing with her carry-on in the Savannah heat, the train pulling away behind her and the south opening up ahead in all its impossible green. The gallery opened at 7. By 6:50, Constance Hargrove had walked the main room 4 times, adjusting things that did not need adjusting, touching the backs of chairs that would not be sat, and redistributing the champagne flutes on the catering table by increments so small that the cater waiter had stopped watching her with confusion and started watching her with the focused attention of someone learning a new and baffling religion. The Whitmore sculpture stood at the center of the room under its dedicated track lighting, 8 feet of prismatic glass, catching the warm beams and throwing small rainbows across the white walls with a lavishness that suggested it was aware of being watched. Eleanor arrived at 7:04. She wore the black blazer, the good one with the structured shoulders, over a silk blouse the color of an overcast sky. Her hair was pulled back with the efficiency of someone who had decided years ago that the time spent on hair was better allocated elsewhere. She carried a small notebook rather than her phone, an affectation she had developed early in her career on the theory that people spoke more freely around a pen than a screen, as if the analog form were somehow less recording, less permanent. It was a useful fiction. She had built a significant portion of her professional reputation on useful fictions. She stood in the entrance for perhaps 30 seconds, doing what she always did upon entering a room reading it. The social architecture first, the cluster of older money near the catering table, champagne already in hand, the kind of people who attended gallery openings, the way they attended charity galas, for the being seen rather than the seeing. A group of younger people near the far wall, artists or aspiring adjacents dressed in the particular studied carelessness that required significant effort. A woman in a red dress standing very close to the Carrasco piece, looking at it with the specific expression of someone who was genuinely looking, which Eleanor noted. And Constance Hargrove crossing the room toward her with the velocity and smile of a woman who had been waiting for this arrival since approximately Thursday. "Ms. Voss," Constance said. She was 60, perhaps, with the particular imperviousness of someone who had been wealthy long enough that it had become her resting state rather than an achievement. She wore a cream-colored jacket and a necklace of large amber beads that clicked softly as she moved. "I cannot tell you what it means to have you here." "You don't need to," Eleanor said pleasantly. "Is there still water, not sparkling?" Constance blinked, recalibrated, and signaled to someone over Eleanor's shoulder. "Of course. Can I introduce you to Vance Whitmore? He's been particularly hoping to speak with you about the centerpiece." "I'll find him when I'm ready," Eleanor said. "Thank you, Constance. The bones of the space are very good." She said it in the way you might compliment someone's posture, true, and containing no warmth, and implying clearly that the bones were where the compliments ended. Constance's smile held with effort, and Eleanor moved into the room notebook, opened the pleasant social face she wore in these settings, like a second blazer professionally maintained and designed to reveal absolutely nothing. She found the still water. She positioned herself near the Whitmore sculpture because that was her primary reason for being here. And she looked at it the way she had looked at it on Thursday, and it was again technically extraordinary and spiritually inert, and she wrote 3 new notes about it that were somewhat colder than the 3 she had written before, because seeing a thing a second time and finding it unchanged in its vacancy was worse than the first seeing somehow. It suggested intention. She was 30 minutes into her circuit of the room when the door opened and Arthur Navarre walked in. She did not know his name yet. She registered him as a composition the way she registered everything in automatic sorting of visual information. Tall, dark-haired, wearing a shirt that had been ironed with a kind of determined competence. The shirt of a man who owned an iron and used it when occasion required, but did not have a particular relationship with it. Beside him, his hand loosely in his father's, a child. The boy was wearing gray sneakers and a slight frown that was not unhappiness, but concentration. The expression of someone arriving somewhere and assessing it, cataloging the variables. Eleanor registered them and looked back at her notebook. Arthur assessed the room the way a person assesses a room when they have been given responsibility for keeping someone safe inside it. He noted the lighting, bright multiple sources, no gentle gradients, the kind of flat, even illumination that a gallery required, and that Leo, who was sensitive to flickering and sudden changes, would find tolerable as long as nothing changed. He noted the music, something string quartet adjacent, coming from speakers he couldn't immediately locate, instrumental, moderate volume, manageable. He noted the people, 40 or 50 of them, the room not yet crowded to the point of overwhelm. He noted specifically the champagne being poured in the far corner, the intermittent clink of glass, the photographer moving through the space with a camera and an attached flash unit. The flash unit. "Leo," he said quietly, "there's a photographer. He might use a flash. If he does, we just close our eyes for a second, okay, like a blink." Leo was looking at the Whitmore sculpture. "It has a lot of pieces," he said. "It does. How many pieces?" "I don't know, bud. A lot." Leo continued to look at it with the focused, dispassionate attention of a child who was not moved by the sculpture's intended grandeur, but found it interesting in a more granular way, the way a child might find a complicated machine, interesting the question of how, rather than the question of why. Arthur spotted his agent's wave from across the room. Petra, in a blue dress, was standing with a man Arthur recognized from the author photo on the back of 3 notable picture books. Marcus Chen. Trim mid-40s, the kind of quiet confidence that didn't arrive from nothing. Arthur looked at Leo. "Bud, I need to go talk to someone for a few minutes. Can you stand right here and look at the big glass thing?" "The big glass thing has 412 visible pieces," Leo said. "Then you can count them while I'm gone." Leo said nothing, which meant yes, which Arthur knew. He crossed the room toward Petra and Marcus, and the conversation he had driven here for Leo visible from his peripheral vision the entire time, a constant necessary tracking. He shook Marcus Chen's hand and said the right things, and listened to Marcus Chen say intelligent things about illustration and the picture book market and the particular challenge of serving a reader who cannot yet read, and Arthur was present for it. Genuinely present because Marcus Chen was worth being present for. He was also watching Leo. Leo had begun to count. His lips moved. He was standing approximately 3 feet from the sculpture's plinth, his arms at his sides, his head tilted back slightly to take in the full height of it, a small figure before a large and glittering tower. The photographer moved through the room. The flash fired. It fired again, and again in rapid succession, because the photographer had found a cluster of people near the catering table who were presenting themselves with the cooperative blankness of people accustomed to being photographed at events, and he was working the angle. Leo's count stopped. Arthur saw it happen the way he could see it happen from across the room, because he had learned to read it the way you learn to read weather, the precise atmospheric change before something comes, the slight shift in Leo's posture, the stilling, the internal cascade that was invisible from the outside. But was Arthur knew a process of losing the thread of something essential? The order of things, the reliable sequence in which the world proceeded, and which was for his son the thing that made the world survivable. Arthur said, "Excuse me," to Marcus Chen, and Marcus Chen, to his credit, nodded as if he understood, which Arthur appreciated. He was halfway across the room when the second flash went off 6 feet from Leo. Leo's body went from still to overwhelmed in the space of a single breath. The sound he made was not precisely a scream. It was more fundamental than that, a sound from below language, the sound of a system encountering something it had not been built to process. He stumbled backward, arms coming up and outward, and his elbow caught the corner of the Whitmore sculpture's plinth. The sculpture did not fall all at once. It went in stages the way catastrophes go when you watch them from the outside, each stage containing the terrible clarity of having been inevitable. The plinth shifted a single piece of glass at the base of the structure, caught the edge of the nearest track light at the wrong angle, and then the whole thing came down in a cascade of sound, so enormous and crystalline and absolute that for a half-second the entire room went silent around it. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then it broke into something worse. Arthur reached Leo before the last piece of glass finished settling. Leo was on the floor, hands over his ears, the sound still happening inside him, even though it had stopped in the room, his body folded inward with a kind of desperation that Arthur recognized as the final retreat the place Leo went when there was nowhere else to go. "I've got you," Arthur said low and steady, putting himself between Leo and the room. "I've got you. I'm right here. You're okay. I'm right here." The room had opinions. Eleanor had been standing 6 feet from the Whitmore sculpture when it fell. She had not moved. This was a professional reflex, or perhaps something more animal, the freeze response of a person long accustomed to remaining still in the presence of spectacular events so as not to become part of them. The champagne around her had spilled in a 20-foot radius. The gallery's chandelier, a large and elaborate affair, was still swaying. A woman nearby was saying, "Oh my God," in the repetitive automatic way of someone whose operating system had overloaded and defaulted to a single output. Eleanor looked at the broken glass on the floor. She looked at the man kneeling with his arms around the folded child. She looked at the crowd that was beginning to reassemble itself from shock into something else, the social species' reliable turn from silence to judgment. The murmuring beginning, and in the murmuring she could already hear the grammar of blame being constructed, the subjects and objects being assigned. She heard a woman near her say, in a voice that was not as quiet as the woman believed, "Why on earth would you bring a child like that here?" Eleanor looked at the woman. The woman was wearing a significant amount of jewelry and an expression of affronted propriety. Eleanor looked back at the man on the floor. He had gotten his arms around the boy and was holding him and talking to him low and continuous, and the boy was making the sound that Eleanor had heard from the doorway of the studio, not crying. Something more interior than crying, a sound of overwhelm that had no adequate social translation, and therefore in a room full of people who required adequate social translation was being read as deficiency. Constance Hargrove was moving toward them. Her face had accomplished a remarkable thing. It contained genuine distress about the sculpture and the desire to perform appropriate response, and a fury so cold it had become structural, all simultaneously arranged above the amber beads into something that was not at its core mercy. Eleanor stepped between them. She did not plan to do this. It happened in the way that certain things happen below the level of decision in the part of the person that exists prior to the person they have made themselves into. She simply moved, and then she was between Constance Hargrove and the man on the floor, and Constance Hargrove stopped walking. "Eleanor," Constance said, "that piece was worth—" "I know what it was worth," Eleanor said. Her voice had a quality in that moment that had nothing to do with coldness. It was something else. It was the absolute certainty of a person who has decided, and the decision was so complete that it made a kind of pressure in the air. She did not look at Constance again. She looked at the floor. The glass was everywhere, enormous jagged pieces, and the powder of smaller fractures, and the scattered prismatic fragments that still caught the light and threw their small rainbows even now, even in ruin. She looked at the child on the floor with his hands over his ears, and his face turned inward, and his father wrapped around him like a fortress. She did not think about why she knew what to do next. She did not ask herself where it had come from, the knowledge, because asking would have opened something she was not prepared to open in a gallery full of strangers. She simply knew. She lowered herself to the floor. The blazer was expensive. She registered this as a distant fact that had nothing to do with the current calculation. She knelt on the floor in the champagne and the glass dust, and the scatter of prismatic fragments, and without touching the boy, without reaching toward him, she placed her right hand on the floorboard 6 inches from where he was folded inward, and she began to tap. A rhythm. Slow, deliberate 4 beats and a pause. 4 beats and a pause. The way a heartbeat has a pause. The rest between beats that is not silence, but belonging. Arthur looked up at her. She did not look at him. She looked at her hand on the floor, and she kept the rhythm steady. Patient, not escalating, not pulling away, simply present in the pulse of it, 4 and pause, 4 and pause. The sound the boy was making changed. It did not stop. It shifted almost imperceptibly, at first the way a tide shifts the frantic energy of it bending toward something that was still distress, but had found within the distress a frequency to track. Leo's breathing began incrementally and then more genuinely to organize itself around the rhythm. His hands came down from his ears by a fraction. Arthur, watching his son, felt something move through his chest that he would not have been able to name in that moment, something so complex in its components that it short-circuited language entirely. The room was still watching. Eleanor was aware of this the way she was aware of weather, the atmospheric pressure of collective attention, but it did not reach her. There was only the floor beneath her hand, the rhythm she was keeping the child 3 feet away, who was slowly coming back. 4 and pause. 4 and pause. Leo's breathing steadied. His body uncurled by degrees the way a fist slowly opens, not because the threat is past, but because the person inside it has found something reliable enough to hold. He took a long, ragged breath. He looked at Eleanor's hand on the floor. He looked at her face. She met his eyes, and her expression was something none of the 40-odd people in the room had ever seen on Eleanor Voss, because it was not a face she deployed in professional settings, was not a face she deployed anywhere if she could prevent it. It was simply attention. Absolute, uncomplicated, completely present attention, the kind that asks nothing and gives everything, the kind that says, "I see you, and what I see is not a problem." Leo said into the recovering quiet, "You did 4 and then a pause." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Do 4 and then a pause again." She did. "Again," Leo said. She did it again and again. The room around them had gone quiet in a different way than it had gone quiet when the sculpture fell. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of something witnessed that does not have an immediate category, that requires the witness to adjust their categories or ignore what they have seen. Several people chose to ignore it. The woman with the jewelry had turned away. Others were looking with an expression that was not yet understanding, but was at least the absence of judgment, the preliminary clearing of space. Constance Hargrove had not moved. She was standing with her amber beads and her fury and her ruined centerpiece, and she was looking at Eleanor Voss on the floor of her gallery, and something in her expression was shifting. The fury becoming something more uncertain. Because Eleanor Voss was not a woman who could be easily handled, and Constance had known this coming in, and the sight of her kneeling in champagne-stained silk performing this act of unhurried patience was information that did not fit any file Constance had prepared. Arthur said quietly so only Eleanor could hear. "He needs to go somewhere quieter." "Where?" Eleanor asked. Her voice was low and unhurried, matching the rhythm. "There's a hallway, past the second room. I saw it when we came in." "Okay." Eleanor did not stop the rhythm. "Leo, we're going to stand up in a minute. We're going to walk to a quiet place. Your dad is going to carry you if you want, or you can walk." Leo processed this. His lip moved slightly. "Walk," he said. "Then we'll walk," Eleanor said. "When I stop this, we start walking." "Okay." A pause. "Okay." She did 4 more beats, then she stopped, placed her hands flat on her knees, and stood up. Arthur stood with Leo, who had unclenched fully now, whose face wore the particular exhausted relief of a person who has come back from somewhere hard. Arthur's hand was on his son's shoulder, and Leo, who did not typically accept the contact, did not move away from it. Eleanor walked ahead of them to clear the path because there was glass on the floor and people still standing in various configurations, and she moved through all of it with a precision that parted it, and the 3 of them reached the hallway, which was dim and blessedly empty. The noise of the gallery muffled behind a heavy door, and Leo sat down against the wall and put his back flat against it and looked at the ceiling and breathed. Arthur leaned against the wall beside his son and looked at Eleanor. She was standing a few feet away looking at her blazer sleeve. There was a smear of champagne on the left cuff and a thin streak of what might have been glass dust along the hem. She looked at it for a moment with an expression that was hard to read. "Thank you," Arthur said. The words were plainly entirely insufficient, and he knew it, and he said them anyway because language, even when it failed, was what people had. Eleanor looked up from the blazer. "How long do these usually last?" she said. "The recovery 20 minutes, sometimes more. It depends on how much was building before." She nodded. She leaned her own back against the opposite wall, sliding down it with the same efficiency with which she did everything until she was seated on the floor with her knees drawn up and her notebook somehow still in her hand. She opened it. She made a note. Arthur watched her. "Are you reviewing this too?" he said. She looked up at him. Something moved across her face, quick and immediately managed. "Force of habit," she said. "What did you write?" A pause. She looked at the notebook. She looked at him. In the hallway's muted light, her face was stripped of the gallery persona still controlled, but more visibly so, the effort of the control apparent where it had not been in the main room. "I wrote the Whitmore piece broke, first time it was tested," she said. Arthur looked at her for a moment. "That's about the sculpture." "Yes," she said. "And you," he said slowly, "are the critic, the one who came to review the show." Yes. He absorbed this. Leo beside him was looking at the ceiling with the settled attention of a child doing quiet internal work, the kind of re-regulation that Arthur had watched him perform 100 times the methodical return to equilibrium. "So," Arthur said carefully, "you're going to write about tonight." Eleanor's pen was still. "I'm going to write about the show," she said, "which I have now to be fair seen more of than I intended to. Including this, including what I choose to include." He looked at her. She looked back, and the look was direct in a way that acknowledged what it was, a negotiation. She was telling him that she had power here, and she was also telling him in the particular way that people tell you things without saying them directly, that she had not yet decided how to use it. "Leo's 8, Arthur said. "He has no more control over what happened out there than the air conditioning does." "I know that," Eleanor said, and the quiet certainty with which she said it made it immediately credible. She had known that. She had known it before she walked toward them, before she knelt on the floor, before the whole of what had just happened. She had known it. "So why did you help?" he said. The hallway was quiet. Through the closed door, the murmur of the gallery continued. Constance Hargrove was out there reassembling her dignity. The catering staff was presumably cleaning up what had been, by any objective assessment, an enormously expensive evening. The wisteria smell did not reach the hallway, which was climate-controlled and internal, but Arthur could still detect faintly beneath the plaster and the old building smell, something like the ghost of it. Eleanor looked at her notebook. She closed it. "Because someone needed to," she said. It was the most honest thing she had said to another person in longer than she could accurately calculate. Arthur did not press her. He nodded once, the nod of a man who understood that some answers were complete as given, and looked back at Leo, who had closed his eyes against the ceiling, not sleeping, just resting behind them in the dark. She came back out to Constance Hargrove 15 minutes later when Leo's color had returned, and Arthur had confirmed that the boy had moved from recovery into the gentle, tired equanimity that followed difficult episodes. The way weather follows weather, one system replacing another. Constance was waiting near the entrance to the second gallery. She had composed herself. The amber beads were steady. Whatever she had been doing in the main room in Eleanor's absence, she had done it with enough efficiency that the broken glass was gone. The plinth removed a large floral arrangement installed with suspicious speed in the center of the space, as if the Whitmore piece had never existed. "Eleanor," Constance began. "The Whitmore was derivative trash," Eleanor said. Her voice was pleasant and level and final. "I've been generous in my notes so far. I would continue to be generous, Constance, with respect to the curation, which has a number of defensible choices amid the obvious ones, if we could handle the situation in the hallway as a private matter." Constance looked at her. "The piece was worth—" "What it was worth is between you and your insurance company," Eleanor said. "What it was worth to your show is a different matter. A centerpiece that cannot survive contact with the room it occupies is, from a critical perspective, a metaphor you've created for yourself, and I am choosing not to publish that metaphor. I'm offering you a transaction. The family's situation stays private. My review addresses the curation as a whole with professional fairness." The amber beads were very still. "And if I don't find those terms acceptable," Constance said. "Then I write what I saw tonight," Eleanor said. "All of it. What I saw in the main room and what I saw afterward, and I am accurate in every particular." Constance was quiet for a long moment. The string quartet music had resumed from the speakers. Somewhere in the main room, a small cluster of guests had reassembled around the Carrasco piece, as if the void left by the Whitmore had redirected their attention to the thing actually worth having it. And what do you want in return? Constance said. You said transaction. What does the other side look like? Nothing from you, Eleanor said. From the man in the hallway. I want a local guide for my remaining time here. Someone who knows the art community, the working artists, the real Savannah. Not the version you sell tickets to. Constance's expression was unreadable, which meant she was reading something very clearly. You want Arthur Navarre. Is that his name? He illustrates children's books. He's not exactly in the same category as the artist showing here. No, Eleanor agreed. He's not. Later, she would not be able to explain this to herself in terms that were entirely professional. She tried more than once in the quiet of her hotel room with her laptop open and her notes arrayed and the wisteria smell at the window. She tried to construct a rationale that lived exclusively in the register of journalism, of research of the working critic's legitimate need for ground-level access to a city's art community. The rationale was not wrong. It was not even incomplete exactly. It was just that it was a building with a false floor, and below the floor was something else. Something that had recognized itself in a dim hallway, in the rhythmic tapping of her own hand on the floorboards, in the way a child had looked at her and said again, and she had said yes without hesitation. She had manufactured a reason to stay near their warmth, and she knew it, and she did not examine it, because to examine it would require opening the thing she had spent 5 years not opening, and she was not ready for that yet. She walked back to the hallway where Arthur was standing with Leo, who was wearing his jacket now and holding his father's hand, and looked beneath the exhaustion like a child who had come through something and was prepared with appropriate rest and sequence and eggs in a blue bowl tomorrow morning to come through it again if he had to. Arthur looked at her. In his expression was the particular careful attention of a man who had spent 4 years learning to read people by watching what they did, instead of listening to what they said. My name is Eleanor Voss, she said. I review art. I have 3.5 more weeks in Savannah, and I need someone who can show me what's actually happening here in the studios and the markets and the places that don't end up on the Hargrove guest list. In exchange, what happened tonight stays out of print. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Leo looked at Eleanor's notebook. That notebook, Leo said. Does it have 100 pages or more? 120, Eleanor said. Leo processed this. 120 is a lot. It is, Eleanor agreed. What do you write in it? I write down what I see. Even when it breaks. Eleanor looked at him. The sentence had no subtext because Leo Navarre did not operate in subtext, and the directness of it went through her ribcage like a key turning in a lock she had forgotten was there. Especially when it breaks, she said. She looked back at Arthur. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize, which was unusual for her, and the unusualness of it produced a faint familiar unease, the specific discomfort of encountering something that wouldn't cooperate with her existing files. 3.5 weeks is a lot of ground to cover, he said. Then we should start early, she said. Tomorrow, if you're willing. Arthur looked at his son. Leo was looking at the door that led back to the main gallery, and his expression was the expression he wore when he was done with a place, when the account was settled and it was time to go. 7:30, Arthur said. The studio. You remember where it is? She did not ask him how he knew she had been on his street. She did not ask because asking would have meant admitting that she remembered the dust motes and the rabbit in the raincoat, and the boy counting stones on a bench in the golden afternoon light, and she was not yet ready to admit how clearly she had filed all of it away. 7:30, she said. They left the gallery through the side entrance, and Eleanor watched them go, the tall man with his pressed shirt and his child beside him. Leo's gray sneakers silent on the cobblestone. At the end of the block, Leo stopped and looked up at the live oak above him, the Spanish moss hanging in the still night air. He said something to his father. Arthur looked up too. They stood there together for a moment under the tree, looking at whatever Leo was looking at, and the lamplight came through the moss and made a pattern on the sidewalk below them, and Eleanor stood at the gallery door and watched, and did not look away. The wisteria smell was back heavy in the night air, warmer than it had been in the day, sweeter the way living things sometimes intensify in the dark when the day's distraction falls away, and the essential quality of the thing asserts itself without apology. Eleanor pressed her palm flat against the door frame. She did not know what she was feeling. She catalogued it as a professional habit, something below the chest slightly left of center. Something that had been dormant so long it had no immediate name in her vocabulary, which was large, which was extensive and precise, and sufficient for almost every situation she had chosen to put herself in. Almost. She stood at the door while the night deepened around the live oaks, and the moss moved in some small, unfelt breeze, and across the cobblestone street the wisteria climbed its fence in the dark and gave off its impossible sweetness, and Eleanor Voss, who had spent 5 years building a life designed to be invulnerable to exactly this kind of moment, stood very still and felt the perimeter of something she had walled off shifting just slightly, just at one corner. Not falling. Not yet. But she could feel with the precision of a woman whose entire life had been built on the ability to see what was structurally happening before it became visible to everyone else, the specific stress pattern of a wall that has been asked without knowing it is being asked to carry something new. She turned back into the gallery. She did not write in her notebook for the rest of the evening. The first morning she was 4 minutes late. Arthur noticed because Leo noticed, and Leo noticed because he had been told 7:30. And at 7:34 the door of the studio had not produced Eleanor Voss, and Leo was standing at his end of the workbench, with his stones arranged, and his eyes tracking the door with the focused patience of a child who had not yet learned to pretend that time was approximate. "She said 7:30, Leo said. "She did," Arthur said. "It's 7:34. "It is." "That's 4 minutes different." "It is," Arthur said, and poured his second cup of coffee and waited, because there was nothing else to do, and because he had a feeling forming in him, since last night with the quiet inevitability of weather, that Eleanor Voss being 4 minutes late was more interesting than most people being exactly on time. She knocked at 7:35, which was the first thing that surprised him. The door was open. She had seen it open the week before from the sidewalk, had stood at the threshold and looked in, and then walked away, a fact he knew, because he had seen her in his peripheral vision, the way he had learned to use his peripheral vision for things he did not want to examine too directly. She knew the door was open. She knocked anyway. "It's open," he said. She came in wearing different clothes than he had seen her in at the gallery. Dark trousers, a white shirt, a linen jacket, the color of unbleached canvas. She was carrying a coffee from the place on Whitaker Street, and she looked at the studio with the expression of a person entering a space they have already categorized and are now revising in real time. She looked at the workbench, at the stacks of paper and the jars of brushes and the half-finished drawing of the bear with the cello that Arthur had abandoned 2 days ago, at the rabbit in the raincoat pinned to the board above the bench, at Leo, who was looking at her. "You were 4 minutes late," Leo said. "I was," Eleanor said. She said it without apology or explanation, which was exactly the right response, Arthur noted, though he could not have articulated why. An apology would have made it a social transaction. An explanation would have made it about her. The simple acknowledgement made it about Leo and the fact of the time and the reliability of both. Leo appeared to file this. 4 minutes is acceptable, he said. 5 is not. "I'll remember that," Eleanor said. She looked at Arthur. He was leaning against the far edge of the workbench with his coffee, and his second morning face, the one that was more honest than the company face, less arranged. He had not slept particularly well. He was aware of this showing. "So," he said, "where do you want to start?" She looked around the studio once more. At the drawings, the organized chaos of the bench, the skylight admitting a column of early morning light that was already drawing the dust motes into their slow upward drift. Leo had noticed them again. He was watching them with his peripheral vision, the same sidelong attention he'd given them yesterday and the day before. "Here," Eleanor said. Arthur looked at her. "You want to start here. You're a working artist in this city. This is where you work." She set her coffee on the only clear surface, which happened to be the corner of the bench closest to the door, a corner that Arthur himself never used, that had remained clear for the 3 years they had been in this studio, for no reason he could immediately name. "Tell me what you're working on." It was not the opening he had anticipated. He had assumed she would want the art walk, the studios, the Saturday market, the names and addresses, the geography of a scene, Instead, she was standing in the middle of his specific disorder, looking at the bear with the cello as if it were a text she intended to parse. "A picture book," he said. "7th in a series. The bear plays in an orchestra." "And the rabbit?" He looked at the rabbit in the raincoat. "Different project. It's not going well." "What's wrong with it?" He considered this question, which was direct in a way most people weren't direct about work in progress, the way people tended to offer encouragement around unfinished things as a social lubricant rather than ask what was actually happening inside them. "The rabbit is supposed to be going somewhere important," he said slowly. "But every time I draw it, it looks like it's just waiting." Eleanor looked at the pinned drawing. The rabbit was sitting, its posture patient, and slightly folded, its expression directed at something outside the frame. "Maybe it is waiting," she said. "It's supposed to be in motion." Motion and waiting aren't always different things. She said it in the way she apparently said most things, flatly, as a statement of fact, without the rising inflection that would have made it a question, or the softening that would have made it advice. Arthur looked at the rabbit. He had drawn it 12 times in the past 2 weeks, and deleted 11 versions. The one on the board was the 12th, and he had pinned it up because it was the least wrong, not because it was right. He looked at it now with a slight shift of attention, the way you looked at something when someone else had just looked at it, the object briefly becoming unfamiliar in the light of another person's seeing. The rabbit was waiting. That was true. It had been true all along, and he had been fighting it because the book required it to be moving. He thought about that for a moment. "Coffee's going to get cold," he said. She picked up her cup. "Where's the Saturday market?" And that was how it started. She came every morning at 7:30, or within 4 minutes of it. She came with her coffee and her notebook and the linen jacket that she switched out eventually for a lighter one as the Savannah heat climbed through the weeks. And each morning Leo reported the precise number of minutes deviation, if any, and Eleanor acknowledged it with the same unhurried exactness. And somewhere in the second week, Arthur realized that Leo had stopped saying 4 minutes is the limit and had started simply saying the number, the way he reported the day of the week each morning, as a form of orientation rather than enforcement. This was not a small thing. Arthur understood it as the significant thing it was. She was a difficult presence to adjust to, which he had expected, and an easier one than he had anticipated, which he had not. She did not perform warmth, did not deploy the softened voice and careful diction that many adults used around Leo, as if he were a dial that required delicate calibration. She was simply herself, which was direct and precise and sparing, with words that didn't carry weight, and Leo, who could detect performance at a distance and found it exhausting, appeared to have processed Eleanor's particular register and found it acceptable. Not comfortable, not trusted, not yet, but acceptable. She was harder to adjust to in other ways. She asked questions that were not soft. Standing in a painter's studio in the warehouse district, watching a young artist named Camille demonstrate how she built up her layers. Eleanor said, "What are you afraid to put in?" And Camille stopped mid-sentence and looked at her and said, after a long moment, "Everything." And Eleanor wrote something in her notebook and said, "That's what I thought, and that's what's missing." And Camille, instead of being hurt, looked like she had been handed something she had needed for a long time. Arthur watched this happen in various forms across 3.5 weeks in a dozen studios, and at the Saturday market, and at the small alternative gallery on Congress Street that showed the work that the Hargrove never would. And he began to understand something about Eleanor Voss that the public version of her did not make obvious. She was not cruel. The coldness was not cruelty. It was the specific temperature of a person who had decided at some point that honesty was the only form of respect she could reliably offer, and she offered it without condescension and without the particular softening that would have made it smaller than it was. She was also, he noticed, watching everything, not just the art, the people making it, the way Camille held her breath before she applied a new layer, the way the market potter named Gil arranged his pieces with the same compulsive exactness that Leo arranged his stones, each piece rotated to its precise optimal angle, and the way Gil's hands hesitated over the display, the way Leo's hands hesitated at the end of a row, the way a textile artist named Rosa worked her loom with the headphones in and the door closed, and the look of someone in a conversation with only herself. Eleanor watched all of it. She wrote in her notebook. She did not editorialize aloud, did not deliver verdicts the way she apparently did in print, just watched and wrote and occasionally asked the one question that landed like a stone dropped in still water rippling outward long after she had moved on to the next studio. One afternoon, walking back from the Congress Street Gallery, she said without looking at him, "You don't just illustrate, you're writing one of them." Arthur looked at her. "How do you know that?" "You look at the text differently than you look at the pictures, like one of them is yours." He was quiet for a half block. The Spanish moss moved above them in the small afternoon breeze. The wisteria was everywhere at this point. It grew along every fence in the neighborhood, and the smell of it had become so consistent that Arthur had stopped consciously registering it the way you stopped registering a sound that had been present long enough to become part of the room. "I've been working on a story for 2 years," he said. "I don't know if it's good." "Is it for Leo?" "Everything is for Leo," he said. Then after a pause, "This one is about him, which is different." She looked at him from the side. "Different how?" "Everything I make is influenced by him. This one would be seen by strangers, people who would look at it and see a version of him. And I don't know if I have the right." Eleanor was quiet for a full block. She was not the kind of person who filled silences out of social discomfort, which Arthur had learned and was still adjusting to the way her silences were not gaps, but completions, the answer forming at its own pace without the pressure of being witnessed forming. "What does he think?" she said finally. "I haven't told him." "Why?" "Because if he says no, I stop. And you're not ready to stop." "And I'm not ready to stop," he said. She nodded once. She wrote something in her notebook. He did not ask what it was. It was in the 3rd week that she picked up a brush. It happened without announcement. They were in the studio late past the hour she usually left because Leo had been at Miss Patricia's and Arthur had been working on the bear illustration that was due Friday, and Eleanor had simply not gone, when she might have gone, had stayed in the corner chair she had colonized sometime in the 2nd week, the old armchair with the cracked leather that faced the workbench diagonally, and she had her notebook open but was not writing in it, was watching him work with the quality of attention she gave to everything, the specific, undemanding fullness of her presence. He had been struggling with the bear's expression. The bear was supposed to be playing with total absorption, the kind of absorption that is its own world self-sufficient and complete, and he could get the technical aspect of it. The bow position, the angle of the instrument, but the expression kept coming out as concentration rather than joy, and the difference between those two things was, for the piece, everything. He put the pencil down. He looked at the sketch. "The hands are right," Eleanor said from the corner. "It's the face. It's the eyes." He looked at the eyes. She was correct. The eyes were looking at the music stand rather than at the music, which was a technical detail that had somehow slipped through and become a metaphysical one the bear was reading, rather than feeling, executing rather than inhabiting. "How do you draw eyes that are inside something?" he said. Not really to her, out loud to the room. She got up from the chair. She came to the workbench. She stood beside him looking at the sketch, and he was aware of the nearness of her which he had been aware of in a maintained and careful way for the better part of 2 weeks, the specific gravitational quality of a person whose self-containment created its own field. She picked up the small brush from the jar nearest her. She looked at the watercolor palette, open on the bench. "May I?" she said. He looked at her. Something in his chest did a thing he did not analyze. "Yes," he said. She dipped the brush. She made 2 marks on the sketch, small and quick, barely adjustments, but she changed the direction of the bear's gaze by perhaps 3 degrees, tipping it slightly upward and inward. The gaze of a creature not looking at something external, but at something interior, at the sound itself, at the place where the music was living inside its chest. Arthur looked at the sketch. The bear was inside the music now. "Where did you learn to do that?" he said. She cleaned the brush on the rag beside the palette. She did it with the specific care of someone for whom the objects were familiar, the motion practiced. "I used to paint," she said. "Used to?" "A long time ago." She put the brush back. She did not look at him. She went back to the chair and sat down and opened her notebook, and Arthur stood at the workbench and looked at the bear with its revised eyes, and felt the question he did not ask accumulate weight in the air between them, where it would remain until the storm which came 9 days later without warning the way the real ones do. The storm arrived on a Tuesday. It came in the way Gulf Coast storms came in the summer, without the extended atmospheric negotiation of northern weather systems, without the long gray pre-arrival that gave you time to prepare. One moment the sky above Savannah was the particular deep blue of late afternoon, the Spanish moss hanging still in air that had become too warm and too thick, and then the light changed and the wind came, and within 20 minutes the sky was the color of a bruise, and the rain was hitting the studio skylight like someone throwing gravel. Leo was already struggling before the storm arrived. It had been a difficult day in ways that Arthur could have mapped in retrospect, but had missed in the forward motion of it. The eggs had been slightly more cooked than usual. The blue bowl had been in the dishwasher, and he had used the white one without thinking, and Ms. Patricia had called to cancel Tuesday, which broke the sequence, and Leo had spent the morning in a state of barely managed unease that manifested as excessive stone arranging and a single repeated question, "Is it still Tuesday if Tuesday is different?" "Tuesday is always Tuesday," Arthur had said 4 or 5 times. "The day is the same. Some of the things in it are different." Leo had processed this with the expression of a child attempting to hold a shape made of water. Eleanor had arrived at 7:30, exactly which Leo had reported as 0 minutes, and seemed to take as a stabilizing fact. She had sat in her corner chair and worked in her notebook while Arthur drew and Leo arranged, and the morning proceeded with the specific, effortful approximation of normalcy. Then the sky changed, and the wind came, and the skylight went from afternoon blue to storm gray in the time it took Arthur to register what he was seeing. The power went out at 4:57. He knew the time because he looked at his phone the moment the lights died in automatic response, and the screen showed 4:57 before the darkness fully arrived. And what had been a studio became a different shape of the same space, the familiar geography suddenly unnavigable in the absence of light. Leo made a sound. Not the sound from the gallery. Something prior to that, the sound before the sound, a small high note of pure alarm. "I've got you," Arthur said immediately, moving toward where Leo was. "I'm right here. Power went out, that's all. Power went out. Everything's the same. I'm right here." He reached the workbench and found Leo by feel the boy rigid against the edge of the bench, his hands gripping the wood, the stone row under his fingers. Arthur put his hand over his son's. "I need to find the flashlight," Arthur said. "It's in the back cabinet. I'm going to find it. I'm not going far." "Don't go far," Leo said in the voice that meant the system was beginning to destabilize. "I won't. 30 seconds. He looked at where Eleanor's chair was, or where it had been. The darkness was complete enough that the shapes were only approximate. "Eleanor?" "Here," she said from the chair. Her voice was calm and unhurried the way it was when she was thinking rather than reacting. "Can you try?" "Yes," she said. "Go." He moved toward the back cabinet, hands out the familiar space, suddenly requiring re-navigation, the storm outside making the sound that storms made when they were serious. The rain on the skylight, a constant roar, the occasional distant percussion of thunder rolling in from the river. He found the cabinet door. He opened it. The flashlight was on the second shelf where he kept it, and his hands found it, and he turned it on, and the beam cut the dark, and he looked back toward the workbench. He stopped. Eleanor was on the floor beside Leo. She was not touching him. She was sitting against the bench leg with her back to the wood, and her knees drawn up close enough that Leo's shoulder was almost against hers, close enough that in the darkness he would be able to feel the warmth of her presence, the fact of her. And she was singing. Arthur stood with the flashlight and did not move. He had heard many things in the past 3 weeks of Eleanor Voss's company. He had heard her ask questions that opened people like windows. He had heard her deliver judgments on art that were so accurate they produced the specific discomfort of recognition. He had heard her say nothing for long enough that the silence became its own statement. He had heard her laugh twice, once at something Gil the Potter said, and once at Leo's description of a particularly problematic stone, and both times the laugh was so unguarded it seemed to surprise her. He had not heard her sing. She was singing in French. Low and unhurried, a song that was not dramatic. Not the kind of song you would choose to perform. It was too simple for performance, too unadorned, the kind of song that existed only in the category of songs sung in the dark to someone who needs to not be alone in it. He could not understand the words, but he could understand the shape of them, the rising and falling of the melody, which was itself a kind of logic, a pattern, as reliable as 4 beats and a pause. Leo was listening. His hands had released the edge of the bench. His shoulders had dropped by degrees. He was not relaxed. Leo rarely went fully relaxed in moments of difficulty, but he was in the song now, tracking it the way he tracked the dust motes and the stones and the patterns that made the world legible, and his breathing had found the rhythm of it. Arthur turned off the flashlight. He stood in the dark and listened to Eleanor sing, and felt something break open in his chest that he had been without knowing it. Keeping very carefully closed the specific internal structure a person builds when they have been alone with a hard thing for long enough that the aloneness becomes load-bearing. She sang for 4 or 5 minutes. The storm outside did not diminish, but it stopped feeling catastrophic. Or perhaps it stopped feeling like the most important thing in the room. When she stopped, the silence was different from the silence before the song. The way a room is different after someone has been in it. Again, Leo said in his exact voice. Once more, Eleanor said. She sang it once more. When she finished the second time, Leo exhaled a breath that sounded like it had been held for a while. What are the words? He said. They're French, she said. They're about a small bird that got lost in the rain and found its way back. Does it find its way back in the song? Every time, she said. Leo was quiet. Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, the roar on the skylight, softening by degrees, the thunder rolling further away. Arthur turned the flashlight back on. He set it on the workbench pointing upward, which diffused the light and made the studio softer, dimly legible. He could see Eleanor now still against the bench leg. Her notebook not in hand for once, her linen jacket slightly askew her face in profile. She was looking at the middle distance with an expression he had not seen her wear in 3 weeks of daily proximity, an expression that had no performance in it at all, that was simply what was there when all the layers of control were temporarily unavailable. She looked like someone who had done a thing she had not planned to do and was now sitting with the aftershocks of it. Arthur sat down on the other side of Leo. The 3 of them sat against the workbench in the upward diffused flashlight, with the storm receding outside, and Leo leaned very slightly, and apparently without conscious decision, against his father's arm, and neither of them pointed it out. After a while, Arthur said quietly, Leo, go get your stones, bud. Bring them over here. Leo went to get his stones. Arthur looked at Eleanor. She was looking at her hands, which were in her lap, which were still. He had never seen her hands still before. She was always writing, always holding the coffee cup, always in motion at the precise and contained rate that was her constant ambient activity level. Where did you learn that song, what? He said. She looked up. In the flashlight's soft upward diffusion, her face was for the first time in his acquaintance with it unguarded in a way that she had clearly not chosen. From someone, she said. Someone important. She looked back at her hands. Yes, she said. The word cost something. He could hear the cost of it. Leo came back with his stones and sat between them, and began to arrange them on the floor in the flashlight's circle, and the storm outside became a light rain, and the studio smelled of rain and linseed oil, and the faint wisteria that had apparently over the past weeks become part of this place in Arthur's registration of it, part of what the studio smelled like now, the way a new element eventually becomes atmospheric. They sat there for perhaps another half hour, until the power came back on with the click and hum of returning systems, the overhead lights too bright for a moment, all of them blinking. Leo said, The power came back. It did, Arthur said. Is it still Tuesday? Still Tuesday. Leo arranged the last stone. Okay, he said. Arthur made dinner. Eleanor stayed, which she had not done before, and which he did not address because addressing it would have made it conditional, and it was not conditional. She sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water while he made pasta. The specific limited ingredient pasta of a person who kept a disciplined pantry, and Leo set the table with the focused care he brought to all ordered tasks, and the three of them ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, that had the quality of a silence that has been earned by something shared. After dinner, Leo went to bed. The routine bath dragon book lights out. Arthur read the dragon book twice and turned out the light and came back to the kitchen to find Eleanor standing on the small back porch off the kitchen door, looking at the wisteria along the back fence, which was dripping from the storm and releasing its smell in the particular concentrated way that wet things release their essential qualities, the rain having stripped away everything except what the thing fundamentally was. He came out and stood beside her. He did not turn the porch light on. The night was cooler after the storm, the air washed clean, the sky beginning to show through the departing clouds in patches of dark blue. He poured 2 glasses of bourbon. He handed her one. She took it. They stood at the porch railing, and he waited because he had learned in 3 weeks that Eleanor moved toward difficult things at her own pace, and that the way to get there was to not push toward it, to simply remain available. She held the glass for a long time. "I had a daughter," she said. The night was very quiet. He did not move. Her name was Margot. The word came out with the careful articulation of a word that was still, after 5 years, physically difficult to say. She was 3. He waited. Eleanor looked at the wisteria. She was not crying. Whatever she had done with this grief over the years had removed it from the category of things that produce tears on contact, had pushed it below that level into the deeper place where things lived that were too large and too structural to be discharged through any single ordinary response. "I was writing," she said. "The review. It was the biggest one I had been given. The artist was important, and the timing was important, and I had been working on it for 3 days. I locked the office door so I wouldn't be interrupted." She stopped. A long pause. She could reach the balcony door. She'd learned to reach it. I didn't know. The wisteria dripped. The neighbor's light was on 2 houses down a warm square in the dark. "By the time I heard her," Eleanor said, and stopped again, and did not finish that sentence, and the unfinished sentence was more complete than any ending would have been. Arthur set his glass down on the railing. He did not reach for her. He understood without being told that reaching was not what she needed, that what she needed was the presence of someone who could hold the weight of what she was saying without requiring her to manage their response to it. "They called it an accident," she said. "Everyone called it an accident. Her father, the investigators, the grief counselor I saw for 2 months before I stopped going, because every session felt like being asked to absolve myself, and I couldn't." She turned the glass in her hands. "I locked the door. I was 50 feet away. I was writing about art." She said the last sentence with a flatness that was not detachment, but its opposite, that was the specific flatness of a person who has said a thing so many times inside their own skull that the words have been worn smooth, but the thing beneath the words has not worn at all. "The icy reviews," she said. "The precision. The apartment with nothing in it." She looked at the glass in her hand. "I built a life that couldn't be touched, that had nothing in it that could fall." Arthur picked up his glass. He was quiet for long enough that she might have thought he was not going to speak. He was not composing a response. He was simply letting what she had told him exist in the air between them without immediately reaching for a frame. "What was she like?" he said. Eleanor looked at him. He was looking at the wisteria. His profile in the dark was the same profile she had first seen 3 weeks ago, bent over a drawing, the concentrated stillness of someone in the act of making something. "She was loud," Eleanor said. The word surprised her. She had not said this out loud before. She had opinions about everything. What cup? What song? What order the things happened in. She stopped, swallowed. She would have been like Leo, I think, in that way, the specificity of it. Arthur looked at her. His expression contained what it always contained when he was feeling something fully, the visible effort of a man for whom feeling fully was not comfortable, and was also, for that same reason, non-negotiable. "You knew what to do," he said, "at the gallery, on the floor." "I knew what she needed when she was overwhelmed." Eleanor set the glass on the railing. "I knew the rhythm. She liked it. For an arrest." The wisteria smell was everywhere, wet and sweet and patient, as if it had been waiting for this particular night to become this particular version of itself. "I have been punishing myself," Eleanor said, "for 5 years with the precision of someone who is very good at their work." She said it without self-pity, in the same voice she used to describe what was missing from a canvas, the clinical accuracy of a person examining the evidence. "I know," Arthur said. She looked at him. "You knew." "Not the specifics." He looked back at the wisteria. "But I know what it looks like when someone is doing that, living at exactly the temperature required to function, not 1 degree warmer." She was quiet. "Eleanor," he said, "what happened to Margot was not your verdict on your own worth. I know you don't believe that right now, but I want you to hear that someone else does." She did not respond. He had not said it expecting a response. He had said it because it was true, and because she was standing on his porch in the dark after singing a French lullaby to his son and telling him the most interior thing she had, and he was not willing to let it be received in silence. They stood at the railing for a long time after that. The bourbon was finished. The wisteria dripped its last drops from the storm. Leo was asleep inside the dragon book closed on his nightstand, his stones in their row on the windowsill, the sequence complete. Eleanor picked up both glasses and turned toward the kitchen door. She stopped at the threshold. "The song," she said without turning around. "It was Margot's. I used to sing it to her." She went inside. Arthur stood at the railing in the dark and looked at the wisteria, which was only wisteria, which had no opinion on what had just happened on his back porch, which was present in the dark. Regardless, patient and rooted and returning every spring, as if returning were simply what living things did. He stood there for a long time. Inside, he could hear Eleanor moving in the kitchen, the soft sounds of glasses being placed in the sink. Water running briefly, the small domestic sounds of a person inhabiting a space with care. Then the sound stopped, and there was the quiet of a house after a storm, when everything inside it has been rearranged by something invisible, and the new arrangement has not yet been named. He was not going to let himself be reckless with what was forming between them. He knew the shape of what it was. He had known it if he was honest since the gallery, since the floor, since the four. And a pause that she had tapped into the boards, as if it were a language she had known before she knew herself. But she was made of fractures she had spent 5 years declaring structural. And he had a son whose world was built on the reliability of sequence, on the certainty that what had been promised would arrive. And what was building between them was, by any accurate assessment, the most promising and the most precarious thing. He turned and went inside. Eleanor was in the hallway with her jacket and her bag, the notebook tucked under her arm. She looked at him with the expression she had been wearing since the porch, the unguarded one, the one that had no professional register, the one that was simply and without the protection of performance her face. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. She left, and he locked the door and turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark hallway of his Savannah house for a moment, listening to the last of the rain. He thought about the rabbit in the raincoat on the board above the bench. He thought about what Eleanor had said, "Maybe it is waiting." He thought about the distinction between waiting and being afraid to move, and whether those were the same thing or entirely different things, and which one he was doing and which one she was doing, and whether it mattered or whether what mattered was simply that in the morning there would be eggs in the blue bowl and stones on the bench, and the wisteria smell coming in through the studio door, and a woman who had arrived 4 minutes late on the first day and had stayed each day since a little longer than the day before. He went to check on Leo. His son was asleep with his arm over the edge of the bed, the way he always slept. The position that had worried Arthur for 2 years before the pediatrician had said, "Some kids just sleep that way." His breathing was even. His face in sleep was the face Arthur had been drawing in every book for 4 years, the face that was the center of everything, the thing. All the bears with cellos and rabbits and raincoats were in some fundamental way about. Arthur stood in the doorway for a moment. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and listened to the last rain moving away over the rooftops, and thought about a woman on his back porch saying her daughter's name for the first time in the dark to the wisteria. He thought, she is going to run. Not now, not tomorrow. But at some point, the weight of what was forming was going to become too much for the life she had built to carry, and the life she had built was going to tell her to leave before it fell apart, and she was going to listen because the life she had built had kept her alive for 5 years, and she did not yet trust anything else to do that. He thought, I know this because I know what it looks like when someone is doing that. Living at exactly the temperature required to function. He thought I said that to her, and I did not say it about myself. He turned over in the dark. Down the hall, Leo slept the clean sleep of a child who had been held in the dark by a French song about a bird that found its way back every time without fail. Who did not yet know what it cost to believe in coming back. Who believed it anyway, the way children believed the sequence, because the sequence had always so far been kept. Arthur closed his eyes. Outside, the wisteria on the back fence had stopped dripping, and the night air was still and clean and full of the smell of it. And somewhere in the city, Eleanor Voss was walking or riding or sitting with her notebook open and a pen that was for once not moving, and the distance between the back porch and wherever she was felt in the dark, both very large and not large at all. The morning after the storm, Leo brought her a piece of broken clay. It was a fragment from a small pot that had fallen from the studio shelf during the night when the wind had come through the gap in the window frame and sent it to the floor. Arthur had swept up most of it and left the larger pieces on the corner of the workbench, meaning to throw them out, and Leo had found them in the morning and arranged them in a row with the focused deliberateness he brought to all arrangements, examining each piece with the turning attention of someone reading a text in an unfamiliar language. When Eleanor arrived at 7:30, exactly 0 minutes deviation, Leo picked up the largest fragment and brought it to her without preamble or explanation and held it out. She looked at it. A curved piece of terracotta roughly triangular, the break edge pale against the darker fired exterior. She took it from him with both hands, which was the right instinct. The fragment being small enough to take with one hand, but receiving it with two, being a different kind of statement entirely. It broke in the storm, Leo said. I see that, she said. Arthur was going to throw it away. Were you going to let him? Leo considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. I hadn't decided, he said. She turned the piece over. She looked at the break edge. She did not say anything for a moment, and Leo, who did not require conversational filler, and in fact found it taxing, waited with the patience of someone for whom waiting was a form of attention rather than absence. It's a good piece, Eleanor said. It was a good pot. How do you know? The curve is right. Whoever made it knew what they were doing. She ran her thumb along the unbroken outer edge. Breaking doesn't undo the making. Leo looked at her. Then he looked at the fragment. Then he went back to his stones. Arthur at the workbench had heard all of this without appearing to hear it, which was a skill he had developed to a high degree, the parental ability to monitor without surveilling, to be present in the periphery. He looked at his drawing. He looked at the bear's revised eyes, the eyes that were now inside the music. He did not look at Eleanor. She sat down in her chair. She set the clay fragment on the armrest beside her and opened her notebook, and the morning proceeded as mornings had proceeded for 3.5 weeks. The studio's specific atmosphere of productive quiet, the jazz from the small speaker on the shelf, the smell of linseed oil and paint, and the wisteria coming through the propped open door. But something had shifted in the room's pressure, in the way that pressure shifted after a storm had passed and the air had not yet returned to its prior density. The room was the same room. The people in it were the same people. The shift was in the space between them, which had been rearranged by the previous night and had not yet settled into a new configuration. Neither of them addressed this. They did not address it the next day or the day after that. What they did instead was continue, which was its own form of address. The Saturday market was Eleanor's idea. She had been to it twice before, as an observer, notebook in hand, the critical distance maintained with professional rigor, moving through the stalls with the specific detachment of someone gathering material rather than participating in the thing itself. She came back on the third Saturday with Arthur and Leo, and this time she did not carry the notebook first. She carried Leo's bag, which Arthur handed her without ceremony when he needed both hands to navigate Leo through a particularly dense cluster of people near the textile stall, and she carried it the way she apparently did most things without comment, with competence, as if the bag had always been something she carried on Saturday mornings. Leo found Gil at the pottery stall. This was not their first meeting. Gil, the market potter with the compulsive display arranging, had met Leo on the previous Saturday and had, in the way of certain adults who had learned their own version of the thing, understood immediately what kind of attention Leo brought to objects and had shown him with genuine respect the specific logic of his arrangement system. Leo had approved of Gil's system, which was based on weight distribution and visual balance, and had offered one modification involving the orientation of the larger pieces, which Gil had adopted without condescension, and with the open acknowledgement of a craftsman recognizing a useful observation regardless of its source. Today, Leo went directly to Gil's stall and began a conversation about a new piece, a wide-mouthed bowl with an uneven glaze that had produced in the firing a pattern of brown and gold that looked less like a glaze effect and more like weather seen from altitude. Eleanor stood beside Leo and looked at the bowl. "Tell me about the firing," she said to Gil. Gil looked at her with the slight wariness he brought to all strangers and said, "You know firing." "I know enough to ask." He told her about the firing. She asked 2 more questions, both of which were the right questions, and Gil's wariness became something more open, and they talked for 20 minutes while Leo rearranged 3 pieces on the display table and Arthur bought coffee from the stand 2 stalls over and came back to find his son and Eleanor Voss and the market potter in a conversation about the chemistry of reduction firing that had apparently required no social warm-up of any kind. He handed Eleanor her coffee without interrupting. She took it without looking away from Gil, her free hand moving with the specific gesture she used when she was thinking a small rotation of the wrist. And Arthur stood beside her and drank his own coffee and watched the market move around them and felt the particular happiness of a person who has spent a long time managing a life alone and has found without planning to that someone has stepped naturally into the space beside them. He was careful with this feeling. He held it at the correct distance. He knew its volatility, but he let himself feel it because not feeling it would have required a dishonesty he was no longer willing to maintain. The canvas happened in the 4th week. Arthur had been working on a personal piece, not an illustration, not commissioned, not for anyone but himself, a practice he maintained with the gilt-edged discipline of a person who knew it was necessary and still had to argue himself into it every time. It was large, larger than he usually worked, 40 inches by 30, and it had been sitting on the easel in the back of the studio for 6 days with approximately 12 square inches of paint on it, the rest remaining stubbornly white. He had told Eleanor it was a personal piece, and she had said nothing had not looked at it, had maintained the specific regard for his creative process that she apparently applied to all the artists she had visited in the past weeks, the understanding that looking at unfinished work without invitation was a form of trespass. On the Thursday of the 4th week, he said, "I want to show you something," and he meant the canvas. She came to stand in front of it. 12 square inches of paint. A corner of something deep blue-green, the beginning of a shape that could have been water or sky, or the interior of something curved. Nothing else. "What is it supposed to be?" she said. "I don't know yet. I've been trying to find the next mark for 6 days. She looked at it for a long time with the quality of looking she brought to all art, the looking that was itself a form of thought, that treated the object as something with intelligence that required a corresponding intelligence in return. "You know what it is," she said. "If I knew what it was, I'd have painted it. You know, you're deciding whether you're allowed." He looked at her. She looked at the canvas. "You told me about the story, the one for Leo. You've been deciding whether you're allowed to make that too." She paused. "They're the same problem." He was quiet. "The marks you're afraid to put in," she said. "They're personal. They'll be seen. It will be recognizable as something that belongs to someone real." She turned to look at him. Her face in the afternoon light was the unguarded version, the one that had become incrementally more available over the past weeks, the face below the face. "I asked Camille that question. What are you afraid to put in? You were there. I remember." "I was asking myself the same thing," she said. "I just had someone else in front of me to say it to." Arthur picked up the large brush. He looked at the canvas. He made a mark. It was a curve sweeping upward from the existing blue-green, the beginning of a figure deliberately imprecise in the way that personal work was imprecise. Not the controlled line of professional illustration, but something looser and more committed, a line that had no correction available because it was already too particular to be corrected. He looked at it. Again, Eleanor said. He made another mark. She picked up the smaller brush from the jar and dipped it without asking, as she had done once before, and she added something to the lower corner, a smear of warm amber, and then she stepped back and Arthur stepped forward, and they worked the canvas in a way that was not collaboration and was not separate work. That was something in between a call and response each mark made, in response to the previous mark regardless of who had made it, the piece, accumulating under both their hands with the specific momentum of a thing that has finally found permission to exist. Leo watched from his stool, his stones in his lap, with the expression he wore when something was happening that he did not have a category for but found on some fundamental level acceptable. They worked for 2 hours. When they stopped, the canvas was not finished, but it was no longer empty. It was a figure large and slightly abstracted, neither quite human nor quite not standing in or near water. The blue-green and the amber creating a light that came from within the figure rather than being cast upon it. It was recognizably and unmistakably about love for a particular person in a particular kind of light. Arthur stepped back and looked at it. Eleanor cleaned her brush on the rag, the careful cleaning of a person relearning a familiar motion, and she did not look at the canvas. She looked at the rag, which Arthur had come to understand was what she did when something had moved her, when she was managing the movement. "It's good," he said. "It's yours," she said. She put the brush back in the jar. "I only put 2 marks in it." The 2 marks changed everything that came after. She looked at him. The afternoon light was doing what it did at this hour, coming through the skylight, in a column that had shifted to the amber register, the dust motes rising in it, and Leo was watching them with his peripheral vision, the same sidelong attention he had always given them, and the wisteria was at the door, and Eleanor was standing at his workbench with paint on her fingers, and her linen jacket hung over the corner of the chair and her face completely undefended. Arthur thought, here. This is what I would put in the canvas if the canvas were not already finished. He did not say it. He didn't have to. She looked at him for one additional moment, the moment that contained all the things neither of them was saying yet. And then she looked at Leo, and whatever the moment was, it was allowed to be what it was without being named, which was Arthur had come to understand how Eleanor Voss allowed herself to have things by not yet naming them. That night after Leo was in bed, he found the clay fragment on the kitchen table. Leo had brought it in from the studio without being asked. He had placed it in the center of the table with the precision of an installation, and beside it he had placed 3 of his smooth stones and a small piece of colored glass that had been sitting on the windowsill for months. A piece of blue sea glass that Eleanor had admired once and said nothing more about. Arthur looked at the arrangement. He went to the drawer where he kept the miscellaneous things, the tape and the batteries and the various small tools of a house, run by a man who had learned to fix most things himself, because the alternative was waiting for someone else. In the back of the drawer, he found what he was looking for because Leo had been asking about it for 2 weeks. The Goldcraft paint. A small bottle, the kind used for ceramics and mixed media genuine gold pigment in an acrylic medium. He had bought it at the art supply store on Bull Street when Leo had seen it in the window and asked what it was for. Arthur had said, "Some people use it to fix broken things." Leo had said, "Fix them how?" Arthur had said, "They fill the cracks with gold, so the break becomes part of the piece instead of a flaw." Leo had been quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a child processing something that was larger than the words used to convey it. "Then it's better than before it broke," Leo had said. "Some people think so," Arthur said. "I think so," Leo had said with the finality of a person who had reached a conclusion and did not require further discussion. Arthur set the gold paint on the table beside the clay fragment. He stood in the kitchen for a moment in the good silence of the house that smelled of paint and pasta and the last of the wisteria coming through the screen door, the house that had been theirs, his and Leo's, for 3 years, and felt it contained the particular fullness of recent evenings, the echo of a third presence, the way a room holds warmth after the people in it have left. He went to bed and did not sleep for a long time. The call from New York came on a Friday morning. Eleanor took it outside, which was how he knew it was significant. She had taken calls in the studio before standing at the window with the clipped efficiency of a person dispatching business, but this time her phone buzzed, and she looked at the screen and she stood up from the chair and said, "I need to take this," and went through the studio door into the Savannah morning. Arthur drew. Leo arranged. She was outside for 18 minutes. Arthur knew because Leo tracked it. She's been outside for 12 minutes, and then 15 10. And then after a pause that had a different quality than his usual pauses, 18. When she came back in, her face was composed in the way it had been composed on the first morning she had walked into the studio before 3 weeks of daily proximity had stripped the upper layers of the arrangement and left the more honest version underneath. It was the gallery face, the professional distance, and seeing it now in this room was like seeing a coat she had stopped wearing suddenly back on her shoulders, too heavy for the indoor warmth she had gradually permitted herself. Arthur did not ask. Leo said, 18 minutes? I know, Eleanor said. I'm sorry. She sat down. She did not open her notebook. She looked at the canvas on the easel, which she had not looked at since the afternoon they had painted it together, her established regard for unfinished things. It's a good week to wrap things up, she said to no one directly. The studio was very quiet. Arthur set down his pencil. He did not do it with any particular force. He set it down the way he set things down when he needed his hands free of objects deliberately and with the care of someone who knew the value of what they were handling. When, he said, she looked at him. In her look was the acknowledgement that the compression was deliberate, that she knew what she was doing with the ambiguity that she was telling him and not telling him at the same time. I have things to finish here, she said. Another week, probably. And then I go back. Leo said from his stool, Go back where? Eleanor looked at Leo. Something crossed her face that she did not entirely manage in time. New York, she said. That's where I live? Leo processed this. He looked at his stones. He looked at Eleanor. But you come here in the morning, he said. That's the sequence. It has been, she said, for a while. Sequences don't stop, Leo said, not as a demand, as a report of how he understood the structure of things. Eleanor looked at her hands. They were in her lap, and she was looking at them the way she looked at things she was not going to write about. Arthur watched her from across the workbench and felt the thing he had predicted in the dark after the storm beginning to arrive in the room with the specific, dreadful reliability of something that had always been coming. She was going to run. Not because she did not want to stay. He was certain of this with the kind of certainty that required no verification. She was going to run because wanting to stay was for Eleanor Voss not a sufficient argument, because the wanting was precisely the thing that made it dangerous, because she had spent 5 years building a life that could not fall. And the life she was building here, the morning coffee and the dust motes and the canvas and the rhythm on the floor in the dark, was the most fallible thing she had permitted herself in all that time. He could see her deciding. He could see it happening behind the composed face, the same process he had seen her bring to every piece of art she had looked at in the past month, the systematic, precise assessment of the evidence, the formation of the verdict, the absolute commitment to the judgment once made. He wanted to say, Eleanor, I have watched you look at broken things for 4 weeks, and every time you called them by their right names, call this one by its right name. He did not say it, because she already knew. And because the knowledge was not the obstacle. The obstacle was the 5 years of architecture that the knowledge was pressing against, and he was not going to dismantle that architecture for her. It was not his to dismantle. And because Leo was on his stool 3 feet away watching his stone row with the focused calm of a child who was also listening to everything. A week is good, Arthur said. There's the open studio on Reed Street you haven't been to. She looked up at him. In her eyes was the full knowledge of what he was doing, the space he was holding, and the cost of it was visible in the fraction of her face that she could no longer fully control in this room. Yes, she said, the Reed Street studio. She picked up her notebook. She opened it. She did not write anything for several minutes, but she held the pen and eventually she wrote something, and Arthur picked up his pencil and went back to the bear, and Leo arranged his stones and the wisteria came through the door, and the morning continued. The last week had a different quality of light. This was not metaphor. Savannah, in late June, tipped toward the specific saturated light of deep summer, the live oaks at their fullest density of leaf. The squares dappled in a green so complete it became architectural, the shadows definitive and dark against the heat-bleached cobblestones. Eleanor walked through it every morning and evening and noticed it with the part of her that had been noticing things in Savannah for a month with an attention she had not brought to a city since she was 23 and living in Paris and painting rather than writing, and the world had the quality it sometimes had in youth of being continuously, almost painfully available. She went to the Reed Street Open Studio. She went to the Saturday market one last time, and Gil gave her a small piece, a shallow bowl, unprompted, pressing it into her hands with the economy of a man who had decided and was not interested in discussing it. She took it with both hands. She spent her last Tuesday afternoon in the studio watching Leo and Arthur with the attention of someone making a record of a place they were about to leave, which she was, but also with the attention of someone who was not sure what she was leaving for, which was the distinction that kept her in the chair an hour past her usual departure. On Thursday, Leo brought her 3 more pieces of broken clay and a fragment of green glass. He placed them in a row on the arm of her chair while she was writing. He stood and looked at them in the same row, then looked at Eleanor. "These are for you," he said, "for me to take with me." "Yes." She looked at the pieces, the terracotta fragments, the green glass catching the afternoon light. She looked at Leo. "Why these ones?" she said. Leo considered. "Because they're the most broken," he said. "The most broken ones need to go with the person who knows about that." Eleanor did not say anything for a long moment. "Thank you, Leo," she said. It was the fullest 2 words she had spoken in a long time. Leo, who registered the quality of things rather than their quantity, appeared to receive them as such. He went back to his stool. Arthur, at the workbench, did not look up. The night before she left, she told Arthur she was going. Not that she was leaving, she had told him that a week ago in the compression of that single sentence. She told him the specific thing, the editorial position, the call from a week ago. Editor-in-chief, the role she had been building toward for a decade, the architecture of the professional life she had constructed with such precision, finally arriving at its planned completion. She told him on the back porch again. The wisteria had faded from its peak, the purple clusters past their fullest week, the smell still present but drier now, less sweet, the end-of-season version. They had bourbon again, the same ritual, and the porch was the same porch, and the neighbor's light was the same warm square in the dark. "I'm proud of you," he said. "I mean that without any other thing in it." She looked at him. "I know you do," she said. "That's—" She stopped. "That makes it harder." "Good," he said. She looked at him sharply. "It should be hard," he said. "If it were easy to leave, that would be a different answer to a different question." She looked at the wisteria. She turned the glass in her hands, the same motion, always the same motion. "I'm not good for this," she said. "What's here? I'm not the right person for this." "You're the person who has been here every morning for 30 days, he said. "You're the person who sat on the floor of my studio and sang my son to sleep in a language he doesn't speak. You are the person who put 2 marks on a canvas and changed every mark that came after." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not asking you to stay. I'm telling you what I have watched you be." She closed her eyes. "I locked a door," she said. Her voice was flat and absolute and final, the voice of a verdict that had been handed down years ago and never appealed. "I know," he said. "You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true and you keep presenting it as if I haven't heard it." She opened her eyes. He looked at her steadily with the patience of a man who had spent 4 years learning that the most important form of steadiness was the kind that did not require anything from the other person, that was simply present without conditions. "I broke the most important thing," she said. "Yes," he said. "You did. And I am not telling you that you didn't, and I am not asking you to forgive yourself tonight. I am telling you that I have watched you be careful with everything breakable in this house for 30 days. I have watched you learn Leo's stones. I have watched you carry his bag on Saturday mornings without being asked. I have watched you hold a piece of clay in both hands. She looked at her hands. "I'm afraid," she said. It cost more than anything she had said on this porch, including Margot's name. "I know," he said for the third time. She looked at him, and this time there was something in the looking that she did not manage in time, something that went through the composed face and the 5 years of careful construction, and was simply the fear visible and undisguised, the fear of a woman who had found something that mattered and was more afraid of staying than of losing it. He could have reached for her. He did not. He understood that reaching would have been about his own need to close the distance, and she needed more than she needed that to make the choice herself. If she stayed, it had to be because she walked toward it, not because it came to her. She set down the glass. "I'll come back in the morning to say goodbye to Leo," she said. "Okay," he said. She went inside through the kitchen out the front door. He heard it close with the particular click of a door that belonged to a house he had built with care around something precious. He stood at the railing and looked at the wisteria. It smelled the way it smelled at the end of the season, the ghost of what it had been at its peak, the essential quality still there, but quieter, asking less of the air around it. In the morning, she came at 7:30. Leo reported 0 minutes. She had coffee. She sat in the corner chair for an hour. She did not open her notebook. She looked at the canvas on the easel, and she looked at Leo's stones on the bench, and she looked at the rabbit in the raincoat above the workbench, still pinned where it had been for a month. Still waiting, still looking at something outside the frame. At 8:30, she stood up. She took the clay fragments and the green glass from the arm of the chair where they had been since Thursday. She put them in the outside pocket of her bag with the care of someone packing something they did not want broken. She looked at Leo. "I'll see you," she said. Leo was arranging his stones. He did not look up. "The sequence will be different," he said. "Yes," she said. "Different isn't the same as over," Leo said. "Arthur told me that." She looked at Arthur quickly and away. "He's right," she said. "Different isn't the same as over." Leo placed the last stone. He looked up at her, the direct, unmediated gaze he brought to things he had decided to look at straight rather than sidelong. "Okay," he said. She looked at Arthur. He was at the workbench with his pencil and the morning light, and the bear with the cello and the studio that smelled of everything. It had always smelled of linseed oil and paint, and the wisteria at the door, patient and present, asking nothing. "Thank you," she said, "for the month." "Thank you for the 2 marks," he said. She held his eyes for a moment that contained in the specific compression that certain moments achieve the full weight of the 30 days, and the storm, and the porch, and the canvas, and 4 in a pause, and a French song about a bird that found its way back every time. Then she picked up her bag and walked through the studio door into the Savannah morning. Arthur listened to her footsteps on the cobblestone even, and unhurried the footsteps of a person who walked the way she did, everything with precision, and without visible hesitation, the control maintained to the end and past it. The footsteps receded. Leo placed a stone. "She took the broken pieces," Leo said. "She did," Arthur said. "Good," Leo said. "She should have them." Arthur looked at the door, which was still open, the wisteria visible on the fence beyond the morning light coming through it, in the way it always came through it, gold and slow and full of rising dust motes that Leo was watching with his peripheral vision, turning them into something seeable by not looking directly. He looked at the canvas. He looked at the 2 marks Eleanor had made, the amber in the lower corner warm against the blue-green, small and precise, and changing everything that had come after them. He picked up his pencil. He did not draw the bear. He pulled a clean sheet of paper from the stack, the large sheet, the kind he used for the personal work, and he began to sketch quickly, and without the hesitation of the past 6 days, the line coming with the fluency of something that had been waiting to be made for longer than he had admitted. A small figure walking in rain carrying something. He drew the rain. He drew the figure's posture, which was not defeated and was not triumphant, which was simply moving forward through the rain with the fact of what it was carrying, the grace, and the grief of the carrying, inseparable from each other. Leo said without looking up from his stones, "Is that the rabbit?" Arthur looked at the drawing. The figure was not a rabbit. It was not an animal at all. It was a person small and precise, walking in the rain with a bag over one shoulder and something carried carefully in both hands. something that caught the light. Even in the rain, something that was broken and held with the specific tenderness reserved for things that are broken and have not yet been told what they will become. "Not this time," Arthur said. He drew the rain. He drew the light in the broken thing she was carrying. He drew the street she was walking on, the cobblestones, the Spanish moss above the live oaks with their impossible permanence. He drew the wisteria along the fence at the end of the street. He drew it at the end of its season, the purple faded, the smell quieter present, anyway present without needing to be at its peak to be what it was. He worked for 2 hours. When he looked up, the dust motes were at their mid-morning height in the skylight column, turning slowly in the gold air, and Leo had eaten his mid-morning apple and placed the core with ceremony on the far corner of the bench, and was now looking at the drawing with the direct, unmediated gaze, the one he used for things he had decided to see straight. "She's coming back," Leo said. Arthur looked at the drawing. "I don't know that," he said. "I know," Leo said. He looked back at his stones. "The broken ones always come back to be fixed. You told me that too." Arthur did not answer. He looked at the drawing, the small figure in the rain walking, carrying the broken things carefully in both hands. Her face not visible, her direction forward the wisteria, at the end of the street, waiting in the ordinary patient way of things that were rooted and would return regardless. He set the pencil down. He picked up the gold paint. He sat at the table and he looked at the clay fragment Leo had placed there weeks ago, the piece of the broken pot with its pale break edge and its good curve, the evidence of a making that the breaking had not undone. He opened the gold paint. He thought about what Leo had said. Then it's better than before it broke. He thought not better, different, honest about what happened to it, wearing the history of the breaking in gold rather than hiding it under the pretense of wholeness. He thought about a woman walking through Savannah toward a train or a car or a plane, carrying broken pieces in her bag with the care of someone who had been told by an 8-year-old who did not operate in subtext that she was the right person to have them. He dipped the finest brush into the gold. He began. The break edge caught the morning light as the gold went in the fracture, becoming under the brush, not a wound, but a record. The history of the thing made visible and luminous. The damage transformed not by being erased, but by being honored. The crack becoming the most honest part of the piece, the part that told you everything about what the piece had survived and what it had been made of all along. Leo watched. After a long time, he said, "That's better." "Yeah," Arthur said. "She'll know what it means." Arthur looked at the fragment in his hands, gold-veined now, catching the light with the specific generosity of things that had been broken and repaired without pretense, that wore their history openly, that were most themselves in the seam between what they had been and what the breaking had made them. Outside, the wisteria was quiet on the fence. Savannah moved in its unhurried way through the morning. Somewhere in the city, or past its edges, already Eleanor Voss was carrying broken things in both hands toward a life that was waiting for her to decide what to do with it, and the decision was hers entirely, and the gold was in the cracks. And Arthur Navarre sat in his studio and held the repaired thing in the morning light, and waited. The way the rabbit in the raincoat waited, with the patience of something that had not yet received its answer, but had not for that reason stopped believing one would come. New York in July was a different kind of heat than Savannah. Eleanor had forgotten this, or had not forgotten so much as had ceased to register it. The way you cease to register things that had been true of your life for long enough that they became part of its furniture rather than facts about it. The New York heat was aggressive and without apology, rising from the pavement in visible waves trapped between buildings that had no interest in releasing it. A heat that smelled of exhaust and hot metal and the particular humid rot of subway grates. It had none of Savannah's density, none of the green weight of it, none of the way the Savannah heat carried with it, the living smell of things growing in it, the moss and the wisteria, and the slow-breathing patience of a city built among trees. She had been back for 3 weeks. Her apartment, which she had described to Min once as the architecture of a life that functions, received her with its customary silence. The white walls, the minimal furniture, each piece selected for its precision of form, its refusal of excess. The kitchen that contained exactly what she needed and nothing decorative. The desk by the window overlooking the street where she had written 1,000 reviews, where the laptop opened to the same files, and the coffee came in the same paper cup, and the city outside performed its reliable, indifferent motion. She had unpacked her 6 blazers. She had placed the clay fragments and the green sea glass on the kitchen counter, which was not where she put things. She put things away. She had always had a system, and the system did not include objects without designated locations. The fragments sat on the counter and she did not move them, and each morning she made her coffee and stood in the kitchen and looked at them, the pale break edges still bare the gold not yet in them, waiting. She had not called about the editorial position. Min had asked once with the delicacy of a man who had worked for her for 3 years and understood the precise gradations of her silences. She had said, "I'm thinking," and he had said, "Of course," and had not asked again, which was one of the things that made Min valuable beyond his professional competence. She was thinking. The thinking was not the clean, directed thinking she brought to professional problems, the systematic assembly of evidence toward a conclusion. It was the other kind, the kind she had spent 5 years avoiding, the kind that happened in the early morning before the coffee was made, in the cab between appointments in the gallery she had walked through on her second day back, and found herself standing in front of a ceramic piece, a wide-mouthed bowl with an uneven glaze, and thinking of Gil and his display arrangements, and the weight distribution of the larger pieces, and having to leave. She wrote. She had always written. The reviews, the columns, the correspondence, the notebooks. But she was writing something different now. Had been writing it since the train back from Savannah, in the margins of the working notebook on the hotel notepad she had taken from the room on the back of a receipt from the coffee place on Whitaker Street that had been in her jacket pocket. She was writing about Margot. Not for publication, not for any external purpose she could name. She was writing the way she had seen Camille paint, putting in the things she had been afraid to put in, the specific and particular things that lived below the level of the grief she had managed, and in the deeper place where the grief was still fully itself, still 3 years old, and reaching for a balcony door and wearing the blue dress with the yellow buttons, and saying "Mama," in the voice that Eleanor could still hear in the space between sleeping and waking if she did not immediately apply the architecture. She wrote she had opinions about her cup. She had opinions about everything. She wrote she would have counted things. She would have arranged them. She would have sat on a stool and watched and asked why and not accepted incomplete answers. She wrote she was loud in the specific way of children who are most themselves when they are most demanding of the world's attention, and I was not always patient with it, and I would give everything I have built in the 20 years since she was born to be impatient with it again. She wrote this in the kitchen at 5 in the morning with the clay fragments on the counter and the city outside still half dark, and she sat with what she had written for a long time without closing the notebook. She did not call Arthur. This was deliberate in the way that all her absences were deliberate. She had his number. She had had it since the first week in case of scheduling changes. Or so she had told herself at the time, which had been a fiction she had maintained with less success as the weeks accumulated. She looked at it sometimes in the way she looked at the clay fragments, as a thing that was waiting for something from her that she had not yet found the capacity to give. She was working up to something. She could feel it the way she had felt the storm coming on that Tuesday in Savannah, the pressure changed, the air becoming too still and too dense before the wind arrived. The package came on a Thursday morning 4 weeks after she had left. Min brought it in with the morning correspondence, a padded envelope with a Savannah return address, and set it on her desk with the other mail and said nothing, which meant he had looked at the return address and made a decision about what it might contain and had decided that commentary was not his role today. She looked at it for 20 minutes before she opened it. Inside, wrapped in a single layer of tissue paper, was the Whitmore sculpture. Not the Whitmore sculpture. It could not have been the Whitmore sculpture, which had been 8 feet of blown and fused glass and was now presumably in whatever afterlife gallery catastrophes went to. This was a piece of it. One of the larger fragments from the night of the opening, a curved section perhaps 8 inches long, a piece of the sculpture's lower quadrant that Eleanor recognized from its particular prismatic quality, the way this specific piece had been responsible for one of the larger rainbow refractions on the gallery wall. It had been put back together, not by itself. The piece had clearly been broken further, had been taken apart and reassembled, and in the reassembly every seam had been filled with gold. The The fracture lines ran through the glass in 3 directions, and each one was filled with the gold paint. The same gold, and in the studio light it caught the morning sun coming through her window and threw the light in every direction at once, prismatic and warm and extraordinary. The piece more complex now in its broken and repaired state than it had ever been when it was whole. The gold seams creating a new visual architecture that the original artist had not designed and could not have designed, that could only have been designed by the specific history of how this piece had fallen and how someone had decided what to do with the falling. Leo had drawn on the tissue paper. Not accidentally. He had drawn on it with deliberate, focused intention. She could see this in the quality of the line, the same careful placement he brought to his stones. A figure with yellow paint for hair, standing in what appeared to be a field, or perhaps a market with paint on her clothes. And a smile that had been given more attention than anything else in the drawing, the smile receiving the full allocation of Leo's concentration, its proportions generous and exact. Eleanor sat at her desk and held the repaired glass in both hands. She had been right, she thought about the original Whitmore piece. It had been technically extraordinary and spiritually vacant, had been beautiful in the way of things that had not yet been tested. But this version, this broken and golden version, had something the original had not. It had a history. It had the specific gravity of a thing that had been through something and had been found worth repairing. It caught the light differently now, the gold seams acting as additional refracting elements, multiplying the prismatic effect, throwing light in directions the original architecture had not planned. She sat with it for a long time. She thought about what she had said to Leo the first morning about the clay fragment breaking doesn't undo the making. She thought about what Leo had said on the last morning about the broken pieces, the most broken ones need to go with the person who knows about that. She thought about the French song about the small bird that found its way back. Every time. She opened her laptop. She opened the file that contained the editorial offer, which she had been holding in a state of suspended review for 4 weeks, while it waited with the polite urgency of something important that understood it was not the most important thing currently on the desk. She read it once. The title, the scope, the salary which was significant, the office on the 43rd floor, the staff of 31, the platform, the influence, the arrival at the professional destination she had been building toward since she was 24 years old, and had written her first review in a city magazine that no longer existed, and had been told by the editor that she wrote like someone who had decided opinions were a form of courage. She had been proud of that. She had been proud of it for 10 years. She looked at the repaired glass on the desk beside the laptop, the gold seams catching the morning light and throwing small warm arcs across the white wall. And she thought about a bear with a cello, looking at the music from the inside rather than reading it from the outside. And she thought about the 2 marks in the lower corner of a canvas. And she thought about 30 mornings in a row of arriving at a place that smelled of linseed oil and wisteria, and knowing each morning that the knowing of it was not a small thing, was in fact the opposite of a small thing. She closed the file. She picked up her phone. She did not call Arthur. Not yet. There was something she needed to do first, something she had been moving toward for 4 weeks and had finally holding the gold-veined glass in the New York morning light arrived at the capacity to do. She called the grief counselor, the one she had stopped seeing 8 months after Margot died, the one she had left because every session had felt like being asked to accept something she was not ready to accept. She had the number, still had kept it in her phone for 5 years, with the specific irrational preservation of something you do not use, but cannot delete the way you kept certain objects in a drawer, not because you needed them, but because the act of throwing them away required a certainty you did not have. The counselor's name was Dr. Antonia Walsh. She answered on the 3rd ring. Eleanor said, "This is Eleanor Voss. I was your client 5 years ago. I stopped coming." Doctor. Walsh said, I remember you, Eleanor. Eleanor looked at the gold-veined glass. "I'm ready to come back," she said. 3 days later, she resigned. She wrote the letter herself, which was the correct thing to do, and also the harder thing. No intermediary. No man as buffer. Just Eleanor at her desk at 6 in the morning, writing with the precision and care she brought to everything she wrote, which meant the letter was honest and complete and contained no performance of regret she did not feel and no omission of the regret she did. She was grateful for the offer. She was declining it. She was leaving the position of senior critic as well. She would honor her remaining contractual obligations. She wished them well and meant it, and that was all. Min read it when he came in. He sat at his desk for a moment. Then he came to her office door. "Are you going back to Savannah?" he said. She looked at him. "I'm going back to Savannah." He nodded the nod of someone whose private prediction had arrived on schedule. "I'll forward your calls," he said. "Min," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "For the cardiologist appointment. For the 20-minute walk." He looked at her steadily. "You went on more than 20 minutes most days," he said. "I know because you always came back with coffee." "I did," she said. "There was one stretch of days," he said, "where you came back smelling like wisteria." She looked at him. He went back to his desk. She packed in 3 hours, which was the same time it had taken to unpack. 6 blazers reduced to 2, the others left on the bed with a note for Min to do with them, whatever seemed right. The toiletries reduced further. The notebooks, all of them including the one with the margins full of Margot. The clay fragments from the kitchen counter, the sea glass. The gold-veined piece of Whitmore glass wrapped in the tissue paper with Leo's drawing, packed with the careful two-handed attention of something breakable and valued. She did not look at the apartment when she left. She had lived in it for 6 years, and it had been for 6 years exactly what she had designed it to be, a space in which she could function. She did not feel the particular sorrow of leaving a home, because it had not in the truest sense been a home. It had been the architecture of a life that functions. She was interested now in a different architecture. She took the train. Savannah received her in the early evening, the particular evening light of high summer that was different from the spring light she had left, richer and more saturated, the live oaks in their fullest leaf, the shadows long and deep on the cobblestones. She stepped onto the platform with her carry-on, and the heat arrived warm and thick and carrying the smell of the low country of salt and green and the distant tidal rivers. No wisteria. It was past its season. She had known this. She had thought about it on the train, the absence she would arrive to, the motif she had been smelling since the platform on her first arrival finally passed its peak and done for the year. She had spent a month orienting herself by that smell, the way certain travelers oriented by landmarks, and the landmark was gone. She stood on the platform. The evening was full of other smells, salt from the river, magnolia which bloomed into summer when the wisteria finished, cut grass from somewhere and the warm, specific smell of old brick and heat, and below all of it, very faint. So faint it might have been memory rather than present fact. The ghost of the wisteria still in the air, still in the wood of the fences. It had grown along still in the evening, as the day's warmth released what the season had left behind. Not the full smell, the echo of it. Enough. She did not go to the hotel. She went to the studio. She had not called ahead. She had made this decision on the train and had held it without examining it, the way she had learned over 4 weeks in New York and 3 sessions with Dr. Walsh to hold certain things without immediately applying the architecture to let them be what they were, in the dark before she turned on the light. The studio door was closed, which was different from the propped open door of every morning she had arrived here for 30 days. The concrete garden gnome was still at the threshold, its face worn to abstract serenity. The sign above the door, August and Comrie Illustrations. The paint faded to its almost blue. She knocked. There was a pause. Footsteps. The door opened. Arthur stood in the doorway in the clothes of a man who had been working the shirt with the paint on the left cuff, his hair slightly less arranged than his company hair. He looked at her. His face did the thing that faces did when they encountered the unexpected resolution of something they had been carrying, a brief, unguarded opening, quickly but not fully managed. He said nothing. She said, "I resigned." He looked at her for a moment, then he stepped back from the door. She came in. The studio was in its evening state, different from the morning state. She knew the light warmer and lower, the work on the bench and its end-of-day arrangement, the brushes cleaned and standing in their jars. The canvas was still on the easel. Finished now, she could see it from the door, the amber marks in the lower corner and everything that had come after them. The figure in the blue-green light, whole and luminous. Leo was at his end of the bench. He was not arranging stones. He was doing something she had not seen him do before, bent over the workbench with a small brush, working with the concentrated, unhurried precision of a craftsman engaged in repair. On the bench before him were pieces of broken clay, the other fragments, the ones he had not sent to New York, and the small bottle of gold paint open, and the brush was moving along a break edge with the patience of someone who understood that this was not work to be rushed. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her for a moment, then he looked at her bag. "You have the glass piece," he said. Not a question. "I have it," she said. "And the fragments." "And the fragments." Leo looked at her face with the direct, unmediated gaze, the one he used for things he had decided to see straight. He looked for a long moment. "You came back," he said. "I came back," she said. He appeared to process this with the same systematic care he processed all information, feeling for its fit against the existing architecture of what he knew. Then he picked up his brush and went back to the break edge he had been working on, the gold going in steadily along the crack. "The sequence will be different now, Seo," he said to the bench. "Yes," she said, "but different isn't the same as over." "No," she said, "it isn't." She set her bag down. She took out the gold-veined glass still wrapped in the tissue paper and set it on the bench beside Leo's arrangement, and he looked at it without pausing his work, the sideways attention he gave to things he wanted to see, without looking too directly. Arthur was standing near the easel. He had his hands in his pockets, which was the posture she had come to understand as his listening posture, the arrangement of his body when he was receiving something and not yet responding. She looked at the canvas, at the figure in the blue-green light with the amber warmth in the lower corner, at the marks she had made, two of them small and precise, that had changed everything that came after. "I've been writing," she said. "In New York. Not reviews." "What then?" "About Margot." She kept her eyes on the canvas. "I've been putting in the things I was afraid to put in." He was quiet. "I started seeing someone," she said. "A counselor. I went twice before I came here. I'm going to keep going." She paused. "I'm telling you this because I want you to know the state of the thing. I'm not fixed. I'm not at the end of something. I'm in the middle of it." "I know," he said. She looked at him. She had heard him say those two words many times in many registers, and she had understood each time that he meant them, that the knowing was genuine and not performative. But this time the knowing had a different quality, less the knowing of someone who had observed from the outside, and more the knowing of someone who was also in the middle of something, who was also not at the end, who was also carrying what he carried with the imperfect and ongoing effort of a person who had decided that the carrying was worth it. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Neither do I," he said. "Leo will tell us when we're getting it wrong." From the bench without looking up, "I will," Leo confirmed. Eleanor looked at Leo, at his bent head and his careful brush and the gold going into the cracks, with the patience of someone who had understood before either of the adults in the room what the gold was for. She looked at Arthur. He was looking at her with the expression she had catalogued on the first morning in the gallery hallway, and had been attempting to correctly file ever since the expression that had no adequate category in the professional vocabulary that required a different vocabulary entirely. One she was slowly, and with the specific difficulty of someone learning a language in which they had once been fluent and had deliberately unlearned, beginning to remember. She walked across the studio. She picked up a brush from the jar. She looked at it. "The rabbit yet," she said. "Still waiting," he said. She looked at the board above the bench where the rabbit in the raincoat was still pinned, still patient, still looking at something outside the frame. "I think I know what it's waiting for," she said. She looked at the clean paper on the bench. She looked at the brush in her hand. She looked at Arthur, who was looking at her with the same quality of attention he brought to his own work. The full and unhurried attention of someone engaged with something that was genuinely unfinished, that was in the process of becoming rather than arrived. She made a mark. A small one. Deliberate and imprecise in the way that first marks were imprecise, the way that first steps into something were imprecise, the precision coming later, after the commitment, after the direction had been chosen and the foot had left the ground. Leo looked up from the bench. He looked at the mark. "Again," he said. Outside Savannah was doing what it did in the long summer evenings, the light going golden and then amber, and then the specific deep blue of the hour before dark, the live oaks holding their depth of shadow, the squares settling into their evening stillness. On the fences along the street, the wisteria vines were bare of bloom. The season done, the leaves full and dark green and alive, the roots deep in the savanna earth already building toward next spring, already accumulating what it would need for the next flowering, the next release of the impossible smell, the next season of being fully and extravagantly what it was. The studio light was warm. Leo's brush moved along a break edge, gold and patient. Arthur watched Eleanor make her second mark. She made a third. The rabbit in the raincoat looked at something outside the frame, and whatever it had been waiting for, it was not waiting for it anymore. The evening came in through the propped open door, and with it the magnolia from the square and the salt from the river, and the last warmth of the day rising from the cobblestones and underneath all of it, so faint it asked nothing of anyone. The ghost of the wisteria still in the wood of the fences, still in the old walls, still in the warm savanna air. The echo of something that returned every year and would return again, patient and unasked, because that was the nature of things that were rooted. They did not require your belief in them to come back. They simply came back. And if you were still there when they did, if you had stayed or returned or found your way back, the way small birds found their way back in French songs sung in the dark, then the smell would reach you and you would breathe it in, and it would be as it had always been enough. Eleanor made her fourth mark. Leo said nothing. Arthur said nothing. The studio held them in its warm and particular light, and the gold was in the cracks, and the evening moved gently through the open door, and outside the city was alive and indifferent and full of the sound of itself, and inside the work continued quiet and unhurried and entirely imperfectly real. Thank you for staying until the very last word. If Eleanor, Arthur, or Leo found something in you that needed finding, hit like and share this story so it can reach the people who need it most. I'll see you in the next one.